Hi there. Tonight, we're stepping back in time, not to a grand battlefield or a bustling marketplace, but to a place far more intimate and perhaps just as perilous, the medieval wedding. Picture yourself in a drafty stone hall, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. You can almost hear the nervous murmurs, the rustle of rough-spun cloth, and the faint, unsettling squeal of a pig destined for the spit. This isn't the fairy tale wedding you've seen in movies, with doves and endless white lace. Oh no, you probably wouldn't survive this kind of wedding without at least a mild case of the bubonic plague, or at the very least, an incredibly uncomfortable sense of social obligation. Before we go any further, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it means something to you. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always lovely to know where you all are as you drift off to sleep. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported, a silent observer in a world where happily ever after was less about romance and more about real estate. The very air feels different here, heavier with the weight of tradition and pragmatism. You might catch a whiff of unwashed wool or the sweet, cloying smell of fermenting mead. The sounds are raw and unfiltered. The clatter of wooden trenchers, the distant bleating of a goat, the low, guttural murmur of conversations about land deeds and livestock. You're witnessing the quiet anxieties of a young woman, perhaps no older than your own teenager, being led toward a future she didn't choose, or the stoic resolve of a father securing his family's lineage through a well-placed alliance. This isn't just about a couple getting hitched. It's about communities intertwining, resources merging, and bloodlines continuing. Think of it as the ultimate medieval merger and acquisition, but with significantly more awkward dancing. The idea of love as a prerequisite for marriage, the ideal we hold so dear today, was largely a fanciful notion back then, reserved for troubadours and poets, not the practicalities of daily life. For most people, marriage was an economic and social arrangement, a contract sealed by families for mutual benefit. It was the bedrock of medieval society, establishing property rights, securing inheritances, and solidifying social standing. A single marriage could elevate a family, forge a powerful alliance, or simply ensure there were enough hands to bring in the next harvest. Your future wasn't really your own. It was a carefully placed puzzle piece in a much larger intergenerational strategy. And suddenly, picking out wedding favors doesn't seem so stressful anymore. That said, while affection wasn't the primary driver, genuine devotion wasn't unheard of. In some regions, couples exchanged small love tokens, even if their union was primarily strategic. These gestures offered a quiet thread of personal sentiment amid the grander machinations of family and fortune. Historians still debate whether these tokens reflected real emotional bonds or were simply performative nods to the romantic ideals gaining traction in courtly literature. Either way, the main event was always the binding of assets, not hearts. You might even find yourself wondering if any of those young brides and grooms ever secretly wished for a dragon to swoop in and whisk them away, just to escape the endless discussions of livestock and dowries. It was a time when your worth was often measured in sheep and acres, not in the sparkle in your beloved's eyes. It's enough to make you appreciate modern dating apps almost. Consider the ripple effect of a single marriage contract. A lord might secure peace with a neighboring rival by marrying off his daughter, ending years of costly skirmishes. A merchant family might elevate their social standing by allying with a landowning noble, even if that noble was, shall we say, less than charming. For peasants, marriage could mean access to more arable land, shared labor during harvest, or simply having someone to care for you in your twilight years. The stakes were incredibly high, much higher than choosing the right caterer. And you couldn't just swipe left if things weren't working out. You were in it for the long haul, often for the benefit of generations yet unborn. The emotional landscape of these unions was deeply complex, a tapestry woven with duty, hope, resignation, and occasionally a surprising thread of genuine connection. Societal pressure to marry was immense. Unmarried adults, especially women, faced serious social stigma and economic hardship. Life was harsh, and a partner meant shared burdens, mutual protection, and the continuation of your family line, a deeply ingrained societal imperative. From a young age, children understood their potential roles in these marital chess games. It wasn't about finding the one in a soulmate sense. It was about finding the one who best served your family's interests. While we might chuckle at that idea now, the practicalities were paramount. Imagine trying to run a farm, raise children, and defend your meager possessions all on your own, in a world where disease, famine, and violence were constant threats. A spouse was quite literally a partner in survival. Sometimes genuine affection did develop after the wedding, a slow burn of companionship and shared experience. It wasn't the dramatic cinematic romance we crave today, but a quieter, more enduring kind of bond forged through shared hardships and small triumphs. Historians still debate how common these affectionate unions really were. Was it a significant trend or just the exception? Regardless, the foundation was always practical. You might have found yourself nodding along during a particularly dry dowry negotiation, mentally calculating how many chickens that land grant could support. It truly puts a new spin on for richer, for poorer, doesn't it? The very foundation of your existence, your social standing, your future security, even your children's prospects, all hinged on these meticulously arranged unions. It's a stark reminder that what we consider normal in relationships is actually a relatively modern invention. Now that you've glimpsed the unromantic reality of medieval marriage as a strategic alliance, let's talk about the first crucial step in this elaborate dance, the betrothal. This wasn't some casual, going steady announcement. It was a legally binding contract, a promise to marry, often made years before the actual ceremony. Imagine signing a major business deal, except instead of merging companies, you're merging entire family legacies. You'd find yourself sitting in a chilly chamber, perhaps a lord's solar or a merchant's counting house, watching as parchments were unrolled and quill pens scratched out terms that would shape the next several decades of your life. The air would be thick, not with love, but with anticipation of profit and power. The betrothal, sometimes called a sponsalia, typically involved an agreement between the families of the bride and groom. The future spouses might be present, but often, especially if they were very young, their parents or guardians acted entirely on their behalf. This was the moment when the crucial details were hammered out. The dowry the bride's family would provide, the dower the groom would settle upon his future wife, and any other clauses related to inheritance, property rights, or even potential heirs. It was less about whether he put a ring on it and more about whether he put a significant chunk of land and gold on it. If an engagement ring was given at all, it was a mere trifle compared to the serious financial negotiations taking place. You might even find yourself stifling a yawn as the legal formalities droned on, wishing you were out in the stable playing with the puppies instead of listening to the intricate details of a feudal tax arrangement that indirectly involved your future. One fascinating and somewhat quirky aspect of betrothals was their legal weight. In some regions, a betrothal was considered almost as binding as marriage itself. If either party backed out without a very good reason, like a serious breach of contract or an unrevealed impediment, such as consanguinity, being too closely related, they could face severe financial penalties or even social ostracization. It was a serious commitment, reflecting the era's deep respect for oaths and promises. There's even a story, perhaps apocryphal but illustrative, of a young nobleman who tried to renege on a betrothal because he'd taken a fancy to another lady, only to find himself hauled before an ecclesiastical court and compelled to honor the original agreement. Talk about awkward family dinners for the next 40 years. The church, ever keen to exert its influence, played an increasingly important role in formalizing these agreements. While betrothals began as largely secular contracts, by the later Middle Ages, the church began insisting on public declarations and even blessings, emphasizing the sacred nature of the promise. That meant the agreement wasn't just witnessed by family and scribes anymore. It was increasingly witnessed by priests and members of the community. This added an extra layer of moral and spiritual pressure to uphold the commitment. Historians still debate the exact moment when the church's involvement transformed betrothal from a purely contractual obligation into a quasi-religious rite. Was it a slow, gradual integration, or did specific papal decrees dramatically shift the landscape? You, however, are probably just thinking about how many sheep that dowry represents. The purpose was clear: stability. In a world where alliances shifted like the wind and resources were scarce, a formal betrothal provided a degree of certainty. It allowed families to plan for the future, to merge estates, or secure a strategic foothold in a new region. For the individuals involved, it meant their future was, for better or worse, largely decided. You wouldn't wake up one morning to find your intended had suddenly decided to join a monastery, though that certainly did happen sometimes, causing considerable familial headaches. No, this was a done deal. Practically speaking, it might not have been what you wanted, but it was what your family needed. And in the medieval world, family needs almost always trumped individual desires. It really puts cold feet in a whole new perspective, because in this era, cold feet could lead to very warm legal trouble. So while you might dream of a romantic proposal on bended knee, complete with soaring violins and a sunset, your medieval counterpart was likely more concerned with whether the ink on the parchment would smudge and if the promised oxen were sturdy enough. The betrothal was the moment the gears of fate truly began to turn, locking two lives onto a shared, often predetermined path, all for the greater good of family, land, and lineage. No grand gestures, no declarations of undying affection, just the sober reality of two families striking a deal, witnessed and legally binding, laying the groundwork for a future that was anything but uncertain. It was the ultimate trust, the process moment, even if the process involved more ledgers than longing looks. With the betrothal firmly established, you now move to the very bedrock of these medieval marital alliances: the dowry and dower. Forget the sentimental notion of something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue for a moment. In the medieval world, marriage was less about merging hearts and more about merging assets. And these two terms were the financial engine of almost every union. Picture yourself standing beside a sturdy chest, not unlike a pirate's treasure chest, only instead of doubloons, it might contain bolts of fine cloth, a strong box of silver pennies, or even deeds to parcels of land. The air hums with a more mercantile energy than even the betrothal negotiations. This is where fortunes could be made or lost. Let's start with the dowry. This was the property, goods, or money that the bride's family transferred to the groom or his family upon marriage. Think of it as a contribution to the new household, designed to support the wife and eventually her children. In essence, it was her share of her family's wealth, handed over at marriage rather than as an inheritance after her parents' deaths. The size and nature of a dowry varied wildly. For a peasant family, it might be a few chickens, a cow, some household linens, and a sturdy cooking pot, items essential for setting up a modest home. For a wealthy merchant's daughter, it could be a significant sum of cash, valuable trade goods, or even property in a bustling town. And for a noblewoman, a dowry might include entire estates, castles, or vast tracts of land, complete with tenants and revenues. Imagine trying to explain that to your modern-day wedding planner. Yes, darling, for the dowry we're bringing 3 villagers and a fully stocked pigsty. The dowry served multiple purposes. First, it provided for the bride, offering her some financial security within her new family. Second, it acted as a kind of advance inheritance, ensuring daughters received a portion of the family wealth when they married rather than waiting for their parents to pass. This was especially important since sons typically inherited the bulk of the family's immovable property, like land. Third, and perhaps most importantly, a substantial dowry could enhance a bride's desirability and elevate her social standing. A family with many daughters and limited means to provide generous dowries faced real challenges in marrying them well. Conversely, a magnificent dowry could allow a family of lesser status to marry into a more prestigious lineage, effectively buying their way up the social ladder. Historians still debate whether the dowry was primarily a form of female inheritance or a payment for a husband, but its practical impact on medieval life is undeniable. Now let's pivot to the dower. Not dowry. Easy to mix up, isn't it? The dower was the portion of the husband's property settled on his wife at the time of marriage, specifically for her maintenance should she become a widow. This was incredibly important, providing a vital safety net for women in an age when their legal and economic rights were often limited. If her husband died, the dower ensured she wouldn't be left destitute. It usually consisted of a life interest in a specific portion of his lands or other assets, meaning she could use the income from them for her lifetime, but she couldn't sell them or pass them on to her own heirs. Upon her death, the dower lands would revert to her husband's family or his rightful heir. The dower was a powerful legal instrument. It was typically specified in the marriage contract and legally protected, even from the husband's debts. That meant a widow, even if her husband had mismanaged his affairs, often had guaranteed income. It was, in effect, medieval pension planning, but with more cows and less paperwork. A common dower amount was one-third of the husband's lands, a tradition echoing Roman and Germanic legal practices. You might imagine a scene years after the wedding, a newly widowed countess, dressed in somber weeds, sternly reminding her late husband's brother that those specific fields in that manor house are hers for the duration of her natural life. Thank you very much. She wouldn't be doing it out of spite, but out of necessity and legal right. There's even a quirky tidbit about door dower, a symbolic dower declared at the church door immediately after the wedding ceremony. This public declaration made the dower known to all, reinforcing its legal standing and discouraging future disputes. It was a bit like shouting your financial plan from the rooftops just to make sure everyone got the memo. You can almost hear the murmurs of approval or judgment from the local gossips, noting the generosity or stinginess of the groom's provision. The intricate dance between dowry and dower highlights just how deeply financial considerations permeated medieval marriages. Love might be a modern aspiration, but land, livestock, and security were the true currency of commitment. Without these foundational economic arrangements, the entire social fabric of the time would have unraveled. Historians still grapple with whether the dower in practice always provided adequate security for widows, given the often precarious nature of land tenure and the constant threats of war, famine, and disease. But for you, watching these exchanges unfold, it's clear. Medieval weddings were truly the original power suits, tailored not from cloth, but from property and promises. Having navigated the complex financial currents of dowry and dower, you now come face to face with perhaps the most pivotal and least romantic aspect of medieval marriage, the choosing of a spouse. Forget dating apps, speed dating, or even meeting someone cute at a local festival. In this era, the decision of who you would marry was almost never yours. Instead, it was a strategic hand played by your family, with consequences that rippled far beyond your personal happiness. You might feel a pang of sympathy for the young man or woman whose fate is being decided over a goblet of ale and a map, their personal desires utterly secondary to the grander scheme. For noble families, marriage was a potent tool for political maneuvering and the accumulation of power. A daughter could be married off to seal a peace treaty, forging an alliance with a former enemy and preventing costly future wars. A son might be wed to an heiress, instantly expanding the family's landholdings and increasing their wealth. Imagine two powerful lords, faces grim and voices low, poring over genealogies and maps, discussing their children as if they were pawns on a chessboard. My daughter, Lady Eleanor, is a fine match for your eldest, Sir Reginald. She brings with her the fertile lands of Greymore and a detachment of 20 loyal knights. Meanwhile, the children themselves might not have even met, or if they had, it was likely at a formal gathering where they were instructed to behave impeccably, certainly not to flirt. Peasant families, while operating on a much smaller scale, also saw marriage as a practical arrangement. A union could mean gaining an extra pair of hands for the farm, sharing livestock, or combining scattered plots of land into a more manageable holding. If you were a peasant, your parents might eye the sturdy son of a neighboring family, not for his charming smile, but for his strong back and knowledge of crop rotation. A daughter might be sought for her skill at weaving or her ability to manage a household efficiently. Love was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. You might overhear whispers of families trying to keep their children within the village to maintain established social networks and mutual support systems, wary of outsiders who might disrupt the familiar rhythm of life. The concept of free choice in marriage was almost non-existent, particularly for those higher up the social ladder. While the church increasingly emphasized the importance of consent, that a marriage was only valid if both parties willingly agreed, this consent was often given under immense familial pressure. Could a young noblewoman truly refuse a marriage that meant peace for her kingdom? Could a peasant girl defy her parents when her marriage meant the difference between starvation and a slightly less arduous life for her family? It's a tricky line. Historians still debate the true extent of individual agency in these unions. Was consent genuinely given, even under duress, or was it often just a formality? Sometimes families would betroth children while they were still infants, perhaps even before they could walk or talk. This ensured the alliance was set in the stone early, preventing rivals from swooping in. The children would then grow up knowing their destiny, their future spouse, a predetermined fact of their existence. Imagine knowing your entire life, from the cradle, precisely who you would marry. It might spare you the agony of choice, but it also strips away the joy of discovery. There's even a quirky anecdote about a noble lord who, having arranged his infant daughter's marriage, later swapped her with his niece for purely strategic reasons when the niece proved to be of more beneficial lineage. His daughter was none the wiser until much later in life, a rather extreme example of parental proxy decision-making. The decision-making process was usually slow and deliberate, involving extensive negotiations between family heads. Genealogies were scrutinized for any hint of consanguinity, blood relation, which the church forbade as a barrier to marriage. Potential inheritances were calculated, and social standings meticulously weighed. It was less like a romantic courtship and more like an audit. The well-being of the entire lineage, and sometimes the entire feudal domain, rested on making the right match. You might find yourself observing these solemn proceedings, feeling a strange mix of relief that such burdens aren't yours, and a profound awareness of the human cost of such rigid societal structures. The chosen spouse wasn't just a partner. They were an investment, a political statement, and a crucial link in the chain of continuity. So your family has meticulously chosen your future spouse, weighing every asset and alliance. Now let's delve into an aspect of medieval marriage that often raises modern eyebrows: the age of consent. When you picture a wedding, you probably imagine adults, perhaps in their 20s or 30s, ready to embark on life together. But in the medieval era, the idea of an adult bride or groom was far more flexible. You might feel a chill run down your spine as you realize just how young some of these individuals were, their childhoods cut short by the demands of lineage and property. The canonical church age of consent for marriage was startlingly young, 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Yes, you heard that right. This wasn't some obscure local custom. It was the widely accepted legal standard across much of medieval Europe. While actual wedding ceremonies often took place a few years later, typically in the late teens, betrothals could happen much earlier, even in infancy, formalizing the union long before the couple could understand what it meant. Imagine being a preteen, still figuring out how to tie your shoes properly, and already knowing your entire adult life partner had been decided for you. It's enough to make you grateful for the simple freedom of choosing your own socks in the morning. And while 12 and 14 were the official thresholds, betrothals sometimes occurred even earlier. Records exist of infants being pledged in marriage, though these were treated as future contracts that required formal reconsent once the children reached canonical age. If a marriage occurred before that age, it was considered imperfect and could be annulled unless the couple, upon reaching 12 or 14, explicitly chose to ratify it. Think of it as a medieval undo button, but only if you remembered to press it at the right time. You can almost picture a bewildered 13-year-old being asked, "Do you confirm your marriage?" having likely forgotten they'd been betrothed years ago. Why such young ages? Life expectancy was short. If you wanted heirs in the continuation of your family line, you had to start early. Delaying marriage meant risking death from disease, famine, or warfare before you could produce children. For nobles, early betrothals locked in alliances for longer and prevented rivals from snatching up desirable heirs. For peasants, marrying off children meant forming new household units that could contribute to the labor force. It was less about nurturing young love and more about pragmatic population management. Historians still debate whether the modern concept of childhood even existed in the same way back then. Were these young brides and grooms seen as children, or as small adults expected to take on responsibilities as soon as they were physically able? The evidence is mixed. Some sources show playful, childlike behavior, while others reveal children deeply integrated into adult work and social roles. The practical implications were profound. Girls often transitioned abruptly from girlhood to managing households and bearing children, many becoming mothers by 13 or 14, placing immense strain on their young bodies in an era with little medical support. Boys, meanwhile, were expected to manage land, lead tenants, and even fulfill military duties at ages when today they'd be playing video games. There were no gap years, no extended adolescence. Your future was set, and you were expected to step into it, ready or not. It makes you wonder how many medieval young adult novels would have simply ended with, "And then she got married at 13 and had 6 children. The end." A real page-turner, I'm sure. So you've witnessed the solemn betrothal, understood the weight of dowry and dower, and perhaps winced at the incredibly young ages at which these unions were forged. Now let's turn to an essential and highly public step that ensured the entire community knew about the impending nuptials, the banns of marriage. This wasn't just a quaint tradition. It was a crucial safeguard designed to prevent unlawful marriages and ensure transparency in a world where written records were scarce and communities were tight-knit. Picture yourself standing in a stone church, surrounded by neighbors, as the local priest reads out names during Sunday Mass, his voice echoing off cold walls. You might be a little bored until you realize this announcement could make or break someone's future. The posting of bans became a widespread and vital practice across medieval Europe, enforced by canon law. Essentially, the intention to marry was publicly announced in the parish churches of both the bride and groom for 3 consecutive Sundays or holy days, always during the main service, when the most people would be present. The priest would declare the couple's names and invite anyone who knew of a legal impediment to come forward. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a very public social media announcement. But instead of likes, you're hoping for silence. What counted as a legal impediment? The list was extensive. Chief among them was consanguinity, being too closely related by blood. The church forbade marriage within 7 degrees of kinship, later reduced to 4. Then there was affinity, being too closely tied by marriage, such as wanting to wed your deceased spouse's sibling. Other barriers included a pre-existing marriage, a solemn vow of chastity, or even a secret betrothal to someone else. Imagine a distant cousin, someone you hadn't seen since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, suddenly stepping forward during the bans to reveal a shared great-great-grandmother. Your wedding plans could grind to a halt overnight. Historians still debate how effective the bans truly were, especially in larger or more mobile populations. But they certainly acted as a powerful deterrent. And here's a quirky detail. Objections weren't always whispered discreetly to the priest. Sometimes someone would call out publicly during the service, causing gasps and murmurs to ripple through the congregation. "But Father, he's already secretly married to my sister's cousin 3 villages over." It would be the ultimate church drama, far more captivating than the sermon, and instant fuel for the local gossip mill. Of course, making a false accusation carried serious consequences, so objections had to be legitimate and provable. Beyond catching impediments, the bans served other crucial purposes. First, they formalized the couple's intention, turning a private agreement into a public commitment. No secret midnight elopements for most people. This was a community affair. Second, they enabled social oversight. Everyone knew who was marrying whom, and the village could exert subtle, or not so subtle, pressure to ensure customs were followed. Third, they reinforced the church's authority over marriage, slowly shifting it from a secular contract to a sacred sacrament. If an impediment was raised, the marriage would be suspended while an ecclesiastical court launched an investigation, often a lengthy, expensive process involving witnesses, sworn testimonies, and deep dives into family trees. Many couples saw their plans dashed by the discovery of a too close blood tie, forcing them to seek a papal dispensation, a special, costly, and hard-to-obtain permission from the Pope, or abandon the union altogether. So that nervous twitch you feel while waiting for your name to be called during a school assembly? Multiply it by 1,000, add the weight of your family's honor, and you're getting close to the medieval band's experience. It was a moment of public scrutiny, a final test of worthiness before the ultimate commitment. You've heard the bands, so the whole village knows you're getting hitched. Now before the actual ceremony comes a layer of complexity that might surprise you: prenuptial agreements. You probably think of these as a modern invention, something for celebrities or the thrice divorced. But in the medieval world, these contractual arrangements were quite common, especially among the property classes, and they were anything but casual. You're now witnessing the meticulous nature of medieval legal minds, ensuring every last sheep and every last acre is accounted for. The historical reality is clear. Detailed written contracts specifying the financial terms of a marriage were prevalent throughout the Middle Ages, particularly among nobles and wealthy merchants. These weren't afterthoughts. They were central to the union itself, drafted with the same care as treaties between kingdoms. These were essentially marriage settlements, meticulously laying out the dowry from the bride's side and the dower, or jointure, from the groom's. Remember that dower we talked about, the provision for the wife if she became a widow? These prenuptial agreements spelled out precisely which lands, revenues, or goods would constitute that dower. They also often stipulated what would happen to the dowry in various scenarios: if the bride died without heirs, if the marriage was annulled, or even if the groom passed away before the union was consummated. It was a rigorous exercise in risk management, medieval style. But these agreements went far beyond just dowry and dower. They could specify the number of attendants the bride would bring to her new household, the cost of her wardrobe, or even the scale and type of feasts that would be held. For grand aristocratic unions, these documents could be incredibly lengthy and complex, negotiated over months, sometimes even years. Imagine a legal team, albeit in monk's robes, poring over scrolls, debating the yield of a specific pasture or the value of a mill on the riverbank. Every possible contingency was considered: the distribution of personal property, the guardianship of future children, even the burial rights of the spouses. You might feel a dull ache in your head just imagining the sheer volume of bureaucratic detail involved, far more intricate than picking out dinnerware patterns. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of these prenuptial contracts even contain clauses about the physical appearance of the prospective spouse. While certainly not common, there are rare instances where a contract included a provision stating that if the intended spouse turned out to have a disfiguring illness or a severe physical deformity not disclosed beforehand, the agreement could be voided. It's a stark, if somewhat chilling, reminder that medieval marriage was indeed a transaction, and the goods had to meet a certain standard. Historians still debate how often such clauses were actually invoked, or if they merely served as a deterrent against deception during negotiations. Was it genuine concern for health and appearance, or simply another layer of legal protection against bad faith? Either way, it paints a vivid, if unflattering, picture of a deeply pragmatic world. These prenuptials were vital for the security of both families. For the bride's family, it ensured their daughter would be provided for, regardless of her husband's fortunes or eventual demise. For the groom's family, it clarified what assets were entering the marriage and protected their lineage by specifying which properties would support the wife and which would remain strictly within the husband's inheritance. This minimized disputes over property, a constant threat in a society where land equaled power. Without these detailed agreements, ownership could become hopelessly muddled, leading to costly lawsuits or even violent feuds between kin. The language in these documents was formal and precise, filled with Latin phrases and archaic terms for inheritance and tenure. Scribes, often monastic, would meticulously hand-copy them onto durable parchment, sealed with the impressive wax seals of the negotiating parties. These weren't just contracts, they were the ultimate expression of trust, foresight, and long-term planning. They reveal that medieval people, Despite living in a world we often imagine as chaotic, were remarkably methodical when it came to safeguarding their financial and familial futures. So the next time you hear about a celebrity prenup, remember, it's a tradition with roots stretching back over 1,000 years. When it comes to money and marriage, some things truly never change. You might even find yourself silently applauding their foresight, even if your own wedding plans involve nothing more complicated than choosing between chicken or fish. With the complex financial and legal intricacies of betrothal and prenuptial agreements firmly behind you, it's time to consider what the medieval bride and groom actually wore. If your mind conjures images of flowing white gowns and perfectly tailored suits, you're in for a delightful medieval reality check. Wedding attire, then, was less about grand display and more about symbolism, not sparkle. You might find yourself peering at rough textures and muted colors, a stark contrast to the dazzling silks and satins of modern bridal magazines. The historical truth is that the white wedding dress, as we know it, is a relatively recent invention, popularized by Queen Victoria in 1840. In the medieval period, there was no prescribed wedding color or style. Instead, brides and grooms simply wore their best clothes, garments made from the finest fabrics they could afford, often dyed in rich, vibrant hues that signaled wealth and status. Think deep reds, forest greens, or royal blues, colors achieved with expensive pigments like woad or madder root. A noble bride might wear a gown of silk or fine wool, perhaps embroidered with gold thread, layered with a surcoat and a fur-trimmed mantle. A peasant bride would don her newest and sturdiest tunic and kirtle, likely made of coarse wool or linen, but still her very best. The emphasis wasn't on bridal aesthetics. It was on demonstrating the family's standing and prosperity. Men dressed just as carefully. A noble groom might wear a finely woven tunic, hose, and a fur-lined cloak. A peasant, his cleanest shirt and a new pair of boots. The goal was to look dignified, prosperous, and appropriately dressed for a formal occasion, not to make a fashion statement. Practicality mattered too. Warmth in an unheated hall, durability for a garment that might serve as Sunday best for years to come. Here's a charming detail. While white wasn't the norm, blue was a particularly favored color for brides across social classes. Why? Because blue symbolized purity, fidelity, and the Virgin Mary. A bride in blue was subtly invoking divine blessing and signaling her virtuous intentions. You might imagine a peasant girl proudly wearing a new blue apron or tying a blue ribbon in her hair, her own small nod to tradition and hope for a faithful marriage. Beyond color, accessories carried deep symbolic weight. A veil, though not necessarily white, was common, representing modesty and purity. Noble women might wear jeweled circlets or elaborate headdresses to denote status. Grooms might don a special belt or cap, and flowers or herbs, like rosemary for remembrance or myrtle for love, were often tucked into sleeves or pinned to tunics. These weren't just decorative, they were believed to ward off evil spirits and bring blessings to the union. You might notice a small pouch of fragrant herbs hidden in a bride's sleeve, a tiny talisman against life's uncertainties. Historians still debate how much personal choice individuals had in their wedding attire, especially in arranged marriages. Was everything dictated by family, finances, and tradition? Or did personal preferences sometimes sneak in? A favorite shade of green? A request for new boots? Likely the big decisions were made by elders, but small acts of self-expression may have found their way in. Regardless, the overarching goal remained: to present the family in the best possible light, using clothing as a language of status, intention, and hope. So as you observe these practical yet meaningful garments, remember, every thread, every color, every sprig of rosemary told a story, older, quieter, and far more grounded than our modern tales of sartorial splendor. You've seen the attire, more a reflection of status than fashion. Now let's turn to the invisible yet immensely powerful force that increasingly shaped these unions: the church. In the early Middle Ages, marriage was largely a secular, contractual affair, arranged and witnessed within families. But over time, the church steadily asserted its authority, transforming marriage from a civil agreement into a sacred sacrament, a holy bond blessed by God. You can almost feel the shift. Standing in a dimly lit church, the scent of incense lingering, as divine weight settles over what was once a private deal. By the 12th century, the Church had firmly declared marriage one of the seven sacraments. This meant that for a union to be truly valid, not just socially but spiritually, it required more than family consent or property exchange. It needed the blessing of a priest. This was a monumental change. Marriage was no longer just a social contract. It became an unbreakable spiritual bond, divinely ordained and, in theory, indissoluble. This shift gave the Church immense control over people's lives, from dictating who could marry, remember those strict rules on consanguinity, to enforcing fidelity and overseeing inheritance. Before this, couples could marry through mutual consent and cohabitation, a kind of common law union. But the Church increasingly insisted on formal ceremonies on consecrated ground, presided over by a cleric. This wasn't just about ritual, it was about control. By claiming authority over marriage, the Church gained influence over legitimacy, inheritance, and moral conduct. You might notice family heads, once the sole arbiters of their children's futures, now deferring to the local priest or bishop. Their secular agreements now required the stamp of divine approval. Here's a telling detail. The Church eventually mandated that marriages take place at the church door, or in the porch, not inside the nave, and certainly not in private homes. This made the ceremony a public event, witnessed by the community and blessed by a priest. Imagine a nervous young couple standing on cold stone steps, villagers peering over their shoulders as the priest recites Latin vows. It wasn't about convenience. It was a carefully orchestrated display of spiritual authority, ensuring everyone knew who defined marriage now. The Church also rigorously enforced rules about impediments, especially kinship. Marrying even a distant cousin required a papal dispensation, which was costly and hard to obtain. While these rules may have had theological roots, they also prevented powerful families from hoarding land through endless intermarriage and extended the Church's reach into noble bloodlines. Historians still debate whether these rules were driven more by concern for genetic health or by a desire to control aristocratic power. But for the people living it, the effect was clear. Navigating your family tree became a matter not just of social etiquette, but of eternal salvation. And the Church's role didn't end at the wedding. It regulated marital life, promoting fidelity, condemning adultery, and hearing disputes in ecclesiastical courts. The ideal of "till death do us part" emerged from this teaching, shaping Western expectations of marriage for centuries. So while you might focus on the vows exchanged, remember, the very concept of those vows, and the sacred ground they were spoken on, was increasingly shaped by a powerful spiritual institution. The faint echo of Gregorian chant seems to underscore it all, a reminder that every medieval union unfolded under the watch. With the Church's blessing now central, the next stage of the medieval wedding often became a public spectacle. The wedding procession. This wasn't a quiet walk down an aisle. It was a vibrant, sometimes boisterous display of pride, wealth, and community. You might find yourself caught in the throng, mud underfoot, air alive with voices, fiddles, and maybe the lowing of cattle being led as part of the dowry. For peasants, the procession might be a small group walking from the bride's home to the parish church, perhaps with a fiddler in tow. But for nobles, it could be a magnificent parade. Richly dressed guests, mounted knights, banner bearers, drummers, pipers, and wagons laden with dowry goods rolling through town. Imagine explaining to a modern bride that her grand entrance includes a literal parade of inherited livestock. The procession served several purposes. First, it was a public declaration, a visible affirmation of the banns already read. Everyone could see it, making the union undeniable. Second, it was a display of status. The grander the train, the higher the family's standing. Third, it gathered witnesses. All those lining the streets could later attest that the marriage took place. Sometimes the route was deliberately winding, taking the longest path through town to maximize visibility. Gossips would set up along the way, critiquing the bride's gown, the groom's retinue, or the number of servants. In some regions, the procession made symbolic stops, at the village well for a drink or at a crossroads for a blessing. These customs, though varied, all emphasized one thing. This was not a private affair. It belonged to the whole community. The mood could range from solemn to joyous, but always communal. Laughter, music, and shouts of goodwill filled the air. This was the moment when contract, faith, and celebration converged, a living testament to a world where marriage bound not just two people, but entire families, villages, and lineages together. While the immediate family might maintain a dignified composure, the accompanying guests and villagers were often far more boisterous, shouting blessings, tossing grain for fertility, or playing lively music on fiddles and drums. It was a day for the whole community to come together, not just to celebrate, but to reaffirm the social bonds that held their world together. The air buzzed with more than just human voices. The nicker of horses, the jingle of harness bells, and the occasional squawk of a chicken protesting its inclusion in the dowry display all added to the joyful chaos. Historians still debate the precise significance of these processions across social classes. While we have rich accounts of noble parades, complete with banners, knights, and wagons of goods, evidence for peasant processions is sparser. Were they equally meaningful on a smaller scale, serving as vital acts of community recognition? Or were they sometimes skipped altogether due to poverty or practicality? Regardless, for those who participated or watched from doorways and fields, the wedding procession was an undeniable force, a living announcement that drew everyone into the story of a new union. It was the visual prologue to the vows, setting the stage with either pomp and circumstance or humble sincerity, depending on the couple's station. You can almost feel the ground tremble slightly as a cart laden with provisions rumbles past, not just carrying food for the feast, but the very essence of a new life beginning. Having witnessed the impressive, perhaps even chaotic wedding procession, you finally arrive at the heart of the matter, the ceremony itself, simple, solemn, and profoundly binding. The bustling streets and curious onlookers fall away, if only for a moment. You now stand within the hushed confines of a medieval church, or more accurately, at its threshold. The air is cool and faintly musty, lit by the flickering glow of candles. This is where promises are exchanged, transforming a secular agreement into a divine bond. The historical truth is that the medieval wedding ceremony, especially by the later Middle Ages, was surprisingly brief and straightforward compared to modern extravaganzas. It typically took place at the church door or in the porch, a deliberate choice by the church to assert its authority before the couple entered for the nuptial mass. The core of the ritual was the mutual consent of bride and groom, expressed through simple spoken vows. The priest would ask each in turn if they took the other as husband or wife, and their "I do," or its Latin equivalent, was the crucial moment that legally and spiritually sealed the union. This public verbal consent was the cornerstone of a valid marriage. Following the vows, a ring was exchanged, usually a plain band of gold or silver, placed on the fourth finger of the bride's left hand. This tradition stemmed from the ancient belief in the vena amoris, or vein of love, thought to run directly from that finger to the heart. The ring was a tangible symbol of commitment and a public marker of the bride's new status. Sometimes the groom received a ring too, though this was less common. Either way, it served as a constant, quiet reminder of the promises made, a small, circular anchor in a turbulent world. Here's a quirky detail. While the modern "you may now kiss the bride" is familiar, the medieval ceremony often concluded with a communal kiss of peace, shared not just between the couple, but sometimes with the priest or even close family members. It was a symbolic gesture of unity and blessing, not romance. Imagine the slight awkwardness of offering a formal peck to your new father-in-law, all in the name of marital harmony. This small ritual underscored the communal and spiritual nature of the union far more than any passionate embrace. Historians still debate how the wedding kiss evolved across regions and centuries. Was it always chaste and ceremonial, or did it carry romantic undertones in some places? Either way, after the vows and ring exchange, the couple would often enter the church for the nuptial mass, a special service dedicated to blessing their union. Kneeling at the altar, they'd receive prayers for fertility, fidelity, and prosperity. The resonant tones of Latin, the rustle of robes, the scent of incense, all deepened the solemnity of the moment, a stark contrast to the street festivities outside. What's striking is the profound simplicity of it all. No personal vows, no readings from poetry, no flower girls or ring bearers, just clear, direct words spoken in public and sanctified by faith. This reflected a society that valued clarity, tradition, and communal witness over individual expression. Every gesture carried centuries of meaning, increasingly shaped by church doctrine. You might find yourself moved by the strength of a commitment made with such brevity, relying not on flowery language, but on the weight of public declaration and divine sanction. That soft echo of "I do" at the church door was the pivot around which entire family destinies turned. But before the church fully cemented its control over marriage, an older tradition lingered, especially in remote regions: hand fasting. This pre-Christian custom reveals the fascinating blend of pagan roots and Christian influence that colored medieval life. You might witness a simpler gathering, perhaps outdoors or in a humble hall, where the focus is on a physical bond rather than liturgy. Hand fasting involved the literal binding of the couple's hands together with a cord, ribbon, or strip of cloth, a symbolic act representing their union. Rooted in Germanic and Celtic legal customs, it was a solemn oath, often made without a priest, relying instead on witnesses and mutual consent. In some traditions, it functioned as a probationary marriage, lasting a year and a day. If the couple wished to continue, they'd renew their vows or proceed to a church ceremony. If not, they could part ways without stigma, a surprisingly flexible arrangement for the era. In areas where priests were scarce, like parts of Ireland, Scotland, or rural England, hand fasting could serve as the sole form of marriage, recognized by the community even if frowned upon by church authorities. These were unions by consent and cohabitation, where the act of joining hands and living as husband and wife was enough to establish legitimacy in the eyes of local custom. Over time, elements of hand fasting were woven into official ceremonies, sometimes at the church door, as a nod to older traditions. This adaptability shows how medieval society didn't erase the past, but absorbed it. So while grand cathedrals may dominate our image of the Middle Ages, remember that, in quiet villages and misty glens, unions were still being sealed with a tied cord and whispered vows, long before Latin liturgy took hold. Yet whether the ceremony was a hand fasting or a church rite, one element was absolutely essential: witnesses. In a world without birth certificates, registries, or digital records, human testimony was the bedrock of legal validity. A marriage could be challenged or even annulled if no credible witnesses could attest to it. These weren't passive observers. They were the living archives of the union. Years later, they might be called to swear in court that vows were spoken, consent given, and rituals performed. Families chose witnesses carefully: respected elders, trusted friends, or prominent community members whose word carried weight. For nobles, it might be fellow lords or bishops. For peasants, the miller, blacksmith, or parish priest. Here's a curious tidbit. In some regions, to ensure witnesses remembered the event clearly, especially if they were elite, or unused to formal proceedings, they might be given a gentle slap or box on the ear during the ceremony. The slight pain, it was believed, would etch the memory into their minds. Imagine explaining that to a modern notary. Beyond memory, witnesses served as moral guarantors. Their presence made it harder for either party to deny the marriage later or claim a secret prior contract. In an age of slow communication and fragile records, their testimony was paramount. You can almost feel the quiet tension as the officiant locks eyes with them, their solemn nods as vital as the vows themselves. Without them, the entire legal and social structure of the marriage could collapse. So the next time you're asked to sign a wedding guest book, spare a thought for your medieval counterparts, whose role wasn't ceremonial, but foundational. They weren't just guests. They were the human archives of truth. With vows exchanged and witnesses confirmed, the solemnity of the church gives way to something far more exuberant: the wedding feast, the true heart of the celebration. This wasn't just a meal, it was a lavish display of generosity, a crucial act of communal bonding, and often the most memorable part of the entire event. You're now immersed in a whirlwind of sound and scent. Laughter, shouted toasts, the clatter of wooden trenchers, the slurp of mead, and above all, the rich aroma of roasting meats, warm bread, and fragrant herbs. The feast, often called the wedding breakfast, even if held at midday, was indispensable across all social classes. For nobles, it could last days, featuring whole roasted boars, swans, peacocks, sometimes redressed in their feathers for dramatic effect, spiced pies, jellies, and elaborate confections. The goal was to dazzle, to prove the family's wealth, hospitality, and social standing. The logistics alone, cooking without refrigeration, feeding hundreds, were staggering. Peasant feasts were simpler but no less joyful. A communal potluck where each family brought what they could. A loaf of bread, a wheel of cheese, a stew made from the best cuts they could spare, and plenty of ale or cider. It was a rare chance to eat well, share abundance, and escape daily hardship. You might see a long table in the village square, faces glowing with warmth and contentment. Beyond sustenance, the feast served deeper purposes. It demonstrated the host's generosity, allowed families to mingle and forge alliances, and marked a joyful transition into married life. Food itself often carried symbolism, nuts for fertility, herbs for protection, or elaborate subtleties, edible sculptures of marzipan or sugar, depicting coats of arms or mythical scenes to amaze guests. Imagine a sugar castle with tiny knights jousting on its ramparts. Everyone ate together, often from shared trenchers, stale bread used as plates. Using knives and fingers, forks were rare. Seating reflected hierarchy, nobles at the high table, peasants on benches. But the act of sharing food created real connection. The feast wasn't just about eating, it was a multisensory ritual of unity, hope, and celebration. And as plates were cleared, the mood shifted again, this time toward music and merriment. A wedding wasn't complete without entertainment, for the wealthy hired minstrels, troubadours, and jesters performed on lutes, harps, and drums, singing epic tales, juggling, or reciting witty verses. At peasant weddings, local musicians played fiddles and pipes, and villagers joined in circle dances, folk songs, and storytelling. Laughter filled the air, feet stomped in rhythm, and even the shyest guest might be pulled into the dance. Sometimes masked mummers performed short plays or gestures, believed to ward off evil spirits with their joyful noise, cracked bawdy jokes. Games followed, riddles, dice, wrestling matches, or drinking contests. Ale and mead flowed freely, loosening tongues and lifting spirits. This wasn't mere distraction, it was communal catharsis, a shared release of joy that strengthened social bonds and blessed the couple's future. Finally, there were wedding gifts. But forget registries or honeymoon funds. In the medieval world, gifts were practical, not sentimental. For peasants, a chicken, a milking goat, a new hoe, a cooking pot, or a bolt of wool could mean the difference between survival and struggle. A healthy cow was worth more than any trinket. For nobles, gifts might include fine linens, silverware, tapestries, for warmth and prestige, or even land, but always with utility in mind. Jewelry served as portable wealth, furniture as investment. Gift-giving was an act of communal support, helping the couple build their household while reinforcing ties between families and neighbors. Each item, however humble, carried real value in a world where nothing was wasted and everything had purpose. So as the fire burns low and the last song fades, you realize a medieval wedding wasn't about romance in the modern sense. It was a web of contracts, customs, and community, a carefully orchestrated event where love, if it existed, grew slowly, like ivy on stone. And yet, in the laughter, the shared bread, the binding of hands, and the hopeful eyes of a young couple stepping into an uncertain future, you glimpse something timeless, the human desire for connection, continuity, and a little joy along the way. The expectation was that everyone who attended the wedding, if they could afford it, would contribute something. This wasn't just generosity, it was a reciprocal obligation, a quiet acknowledgement of the social contract of mutual aid that held medieval communities together. You might see a farmer presenting a sack of grain, a blacksmith offering a new iron pot, or a weaver handing over a bolt of hand-spun yarn. Each gift a testament to their trade and their support for the couple's new life. Here's a quirky detail. Sometimes guests brought bride ale, not just beer for the feast, but specially brewed ale intended to be sold by the bride afterward to raise initial capital for her household. This was a form of entrepreneurial gift-giving, turning the celebration into a small fundraiser. Imagine a modern wedding where guests buy the beer, and all proceeds go straight toward the couple's down payment. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was and its real economic impact, but it offers a fascinating glimpse into medieval financial ingenuity. Beyond material gifts, blessings and good wishes were considered equally vital. Guests offered prayers for fertility, prosperity, and long life, intangible gifts valued as highly as livestock or linen. In a world where life was precarious and fate uncertain, collective well-wishing carried real weight. So while you wouldn't see wrapped presents or gift cards, every item exchanged, a prize pig, a wooden spoon, a length of wool, was a tangible brick in the foundation of the couple's future. They weren't just celebrating a day, they were building a life together with the help of their entire community. With the feasting and gift-giving winding down, the atmosphere in the hall shifts from boisterous revelry to something more intimate, yet surprisingly public. We now approach what might be the most eye-opening aspect of a medieval wedding, the public bedding ritual. Forget discreet goodbyes and private retreats. In this era, the journey to the marital bed was often a communal event, steeped in tradition and witnessed by many. You might feel a peculiar mix of awkwardness and historical fascination as you observe this bygone custom. The historical truth is that the bedding ceremony was common, especially among nobility and gentry, though echoes of it existed across all classes. After the feast, the bride would be escorted to the bridal chamber by the women of the wedding party, while the groom was led by the men. But this wasn't a quiet moment. Guests, especially close family and friends, often accompanied them, singing bawdy songs, cracking ribald jokes, and helping the couple prepare for bed. It was a lively, sometimes raucous procession, ensuring the union was publicly acknowledged right up to the threshold of intimacy. Why such a display? First, it marked the ceremonial transition into married life. Second, and far more crucial, it provided mir and witnesses that the couple had retired to the same bed, a vital step toward proving the marriage would be consummated. In a society where marriage governed inheritance, land, and lineage, undeniable proof of physical union was essential. Imagine your aunts and uncles singing lewd verses while you fumble with your nightclothes. It truly redefines awkward family moment. Here's a curious twist. In some traditions, a priest might bless the marital bed, sprinkling holy water and offering prayers for fertility. The church, while wary of excessive rowdiness, recognized the need for public witness and sought to sanctify the act. So you might hear solemn Latin prayers immediately followed by a chorus of drunken laughter and crude gestures, a jarring blend of sacred and profane. Once in the chamber, guests might help the couple undress, at least from their outer garments, toss a stocking at the groom for luck, or tuck them into bed with jovial advice. The room might be strewn with herbs like rosemary or lavender, believed to promote fertility and ward off evil spirits. Wine or spiced drinks would be offered, and then finally the crowd would disperse, leaving the couple alone, often with one last off-key serenade. The degree of publicity varied. Peasant weddings might involve only close family helping the couple to their straw mattress. But even then, the community knew the union was being consummated. For nobles, the chamber could be crowded with retainers and well-wishers. While jarring to modern sensibilities, this ritual reflected a different understanding of privacy. Marriage wasn't just a private bond, but a public institution. And its completion required communal validation. You might blush on behalf of the newlywed, but you can't deny the powerful message this sent. This marriage was now an undeniable reality, witnessed by all. And that brings us to the final, pivotal step: consummation. Not merely an act of intimacy, but a legal and social requirement that often sealed the marriage's validity in the eyes of both church and state. In medieval canon law, a marriage was not considered fully indissoluble until it had been physically consummated. Vows created a bond, but a sexual union completed the sacrament. Without it, the marriage could be annulled, as if it had never existed. This placed immense pressure on the couple. The legitimacy of heirs, the security of inheritance, and the very future of their union hinged on this one private act. Theological reasons aside, marriage as a reflection of Christ in the church, the practical stakes were enormous. In a world obsessed with lineage, no consummation meant no children, no heir, and potential chaos over property and titles. For marriages arranged in childhood, consummation also served as proof of free and full consent upon reaching adulthood. And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. In high-stakes noble or royal unions, physical proof of consummation was sometimes required. The morning after, a midwife or trusted female relative might inspect the bridal sheets for blood, evidence of the bride's virginity and the marriage's completion. While historians debate how common this was, likely rare outside elite circles, it underscores the extreme measures taken to secure dynastic certainty. Failure to consummate could lead to annulment, not divorce, which was virtually impossible, but a declaration that the marriage had never been valid. This was the medieval escape hatch, often used when a strategic alliance proved barren or politically inconvenient. So as the last guest departs and the chamber door closes, the silence that falls is heavy, not with romance but with profound responsibility. The privacy of the marital bed carried immense public consequence, which leads us to the morning after, a ritual almost as formal as the wedding itself. For important unions, verification wasn't left to chance. Attending women might examine the bed, confirm the couple's emergence as a recognized married pair, or even collect sworn testimony. In rare cases, the groom might be asked to provide a written affidavit affirming he'd performed his duties. It's a stark reminder, in this world, even the most intimate acts were public business. All of this served one purpose: to ensure the marriage was legally unassailable, the lineage secure, and the social order intact. Personal feelings? Secondary. Privacy? A luxury. The institution came first. And yet, what happened when these meticulously arranged unions failed? Not through death or infertility, but through error, deception, or irreconcilable flaws. That's where annulment came in. Not divorce, but a legal unraveling of a marriage deemed never valid in the first place. From the 12th century onward, under Catholic canon law, divorce as we know it did not exist. A valid consummated marriage was considered indissoluble, a bond ordained by God. But annulment offered a narrow path out. If an impediment could be proven, like consanguinity, pre-existing vows, coercion, or non-consummation, the church could declare the marriage null. This wasn't easy. It required petitions, witnesses, and often papal approval. It was costly, slow, and rarely granted to commoners. But for kings and nobles like Henry VIII, it became a high-stakes legal and theological battlefield. So while the medieval wedding was a tapestry of contracts, customs, and community, its ending, if it ever came, was anything but simple. Annulment wasn't freedom. It was a technical correction, a way to say, this never truly was. And in that tension between human desire and institutional rigidity, we see the full weight of a world where marriage was never just about two people, but about land, legacy, and the survival of an entire social order. Marriage was considered a sacrament, a divinely ordained, indissoluble bond. Yet the church did allow for annulment, which was fundamentally different from divorce. An annulment wasn't the dissolution of a valid marriage. It was a declaration that no valid marriage had ever existed in the first place, due to some legal or canonical impediment present at the time of the vows. It erased the union retroactively, as if it had never happened. The grounds for annulment were numerous and often complex, but they generally fell into a few key categories. 1. Pre-contract. one party had already entered into a binding betrothal or marriage with someone else. Given how seriously betrothals were taken, often as legally binding as marriage itself, a prior contract could nullify a subsequent union. 2. Consanguinity or affinity. The couple was too closely related by blood, consanguinity, or by marriage, affinity. The church's rules on kinship were strict, initially forbidding marriage within 7 degrees of relation, later reduced to 4. For noble families who intermarried for generations, this became a frequent and sometimes convenient reason to seek annulment. 3. Non-consummation. If the marriage was never physically consummated, it could be annulled. This was especially potent if one party refused or was physically unable to fulfill the act. It also served as indirect proof of lack of true consent. 4. Lack of free consent. If either party could prove they were coerced through threats, imprisonment, or extreme familial pressure, an annulment might be granted. This was difficult to prove, particularly for women, but not impossible. 5. Impotence or madness. Permanent impotence, not just temporary inability, or verifiable insanity that prevented understanding or consent could also serve as grounds. Here's a telling example. King Henry VIII's attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, primarily on grounds of affinity, since she had been married to his deceased brother Arthur. Though the church had granted a dispensation for that marriage at the time, Henry later argued it was invalid. When the Pope refused to annul it, Henry broke with Rome entirely, triggering the English Reformation. This episode perfectly illustrates how annulment wasn't just a personal matter. It was a tool of a high politics, capable of reshaping nations. Historians still debate how often the system was manipulated by the powerful. Could a noble or monarch effectively buy an annulment through influence, donations, or political pressure? Was it a genuine theological inquiry or a legal fiction for the elite? You might find yourself sympathizing with Catherine, caught in a storm of doctrine, dynastic ambition, and betrayal. Obtaining an annulment was never simple. It required petitioning an ecclesiastical court, gathering witnesses, including those from the wedding and possibly the morning after bedding, presenting evidence and enduring years of proceedings. It was expensive, public, and deeply humiliating, laying bare the most intimate details of a couple's life. Yet for those with means, it offered the only real escape from a politically disastrous or personally unbearable union. So while "till death do us part" was the guiding ideal, the medieval world did provide a narrow, grueling path out. Not through divorce, but through the legal fiction that the marriage had never truly begun. It was a complex theological and legal dance, reminding us that even in a seemingly rigid society, people found ways, however difficult, to navigate the messy realities of human relationships. Which brings us to the stark truth. Divorce, as we understand it, did not exist in medieval Western Christendom. In the Latin Church's view, a valid, consummated marriage was a sacrament, a bond forged by God that no human authority could break. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, wasn't poetic flourish. It was canon law. This meant that once a marriage was properly formed and consummated, it was permanent. There was no undo button. So while the medieval wedding was a tapestry of contracts, customs, and community, its ending, if it ever came, was anything but simple. Annulment wasn't freedom. It was a technical correction, a way to say this never truly was. And in that tension between human desire and institutional rigidity, we see the full weight of a world where marriage was never just about two people, but about land, legacy, and the survival of an entire social order. Marriage was considered a sacrament, a divinely ordained, indissoluble bond. Yet the church did allow for annulment, which was fundamentally different from divorce. An annulment wasn't the dissolution of a valid marriage. It was a declaration that no valid marriage had ever existed in the first place, due to some legal or canonical impediment present at the time of the vows. It erased the union retroactively, as if it had never happened. The grounds for annulment were numerous and often complex, but they generally fell into a few key categories. 1. Pre-contract. One party had already entered into a binding betrothal or marriage with someone else. Given how seriously betrothals were taken, often as legally binding as marriage itself, a prior contract could nullify a subsequent union. 2. Consanguinity or affinity. The couple was too closely related by blood, consanguinity, or by marriage, affinity. The church's rules on kinship were strict, initially forbidding marriage within 7 degrees of relation, later reduced to 4. For noble families who intermarried for generations, this became a frequent and sometimes convenient reason to seek annulment. 3. Non-consummation. If the marriage was never physically consummated, it could be annulled. This was especially potent if one party refused or was physically unable to fulfill the act. It also served as indirect proof of lack of true consent. 4. Lack of free consent. If either party could prove they were coerced through threats, imprisonment, or extreme familial pressure, an annulment might be granted. This was difficult to prove, particularly for women, but not impossible. 5. Impotence or madness. Permanent impotence, not just temporary inability, or verifiable insanity that prevented understanding or consent could also serve as grounds. Here's a telling example. King Henry VIII's attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, primarily on grounds of affinity, since she had been married to his deceased brother Arthur. Though the church had granted a dispensation for that marriage at the time, Henry later argued it was invalid. When the Pope refused to annul it, Henry broke with Rome entirely, triggering the English Reformation. This episode perfectly illustrates how annulment wasn't just a personal matter. It was a tool of a high politics, capable of reshaping nations. Historians still debate how often the system was manipulated by the powerful. Could a noble or monarch effectively buy an annulment through influence, donations, or political pressure? Was it a genuine theological inquiry or a legal fiction for the elite? You might find yourself sympathizing with Catherine, caught in a storm of doctrine, dynastic ambition, and betrayal. Obtaining an annulment was never simple. It required petitioning an ecclesiastical court, gathering witnesses, including those from the wedding and possibly the morning after bedding, presenting evidence and enduring years of proceedings. It was expensive, public, and deeply humiliating, laying bare the most intimate details of a couple's life. Yet for those with means, it offered the only real escape from a politically disastrous or personally unbearable union. So while "till death do us part" was the guiding ideal, the medieval world did provide a narrow, grueling path out. Not through divorce, but through the legal fiction that the marriage had never truly begun. It was a complex theological and legal dance, reminding us that even in a seemingly rigid society, people found ways, however difficult, to navigate the messy realities of human relationships. Which brings us to the stark truth. Divorce, as we understand it, did not exist in medieval Western Christendom. In the Latin Church's view, a valid, consummated marriage was a sacrament, a bond forged by God that no human authority could break. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, wasn't poetic flourish. It was canon law. This meant that once a marriage was properly formed and consummated, it was permanent. There was no undo button. For most people, this created a life of profound finality. Couples trapped in unhappy, abusive, or barren marriages had almost no recourse. Annulment only applied if the marriage was invalid from the start, not if it simply failed over time. However, there was one limited alternative: divorce a mensa et thoro, from bed and board. This was a legal separation that allowed spouses to live apart, sometimes with a formal division of property, but neither could remarry. While the other lived, it was often granted for adultery, cruelty, or extreme incompatibility, but it left both parties in a kind of marital purgatory, free to live separately, yet forever bound. And because true divorce was forbidden, people sometimes resorted to creative and scandalous tactics. We find records of individuals suddenly discovering a distant cousin they'd never met, or claiming their spouse was impotent, sometimes even staging tests. These weren't always lies, but they reveal how desperately people sought escape routes in a system that offered none. The inability to divorce shaped medieval life in deep ways. Marital conflicts had to be resolved within the union or through separation. Remarriage was only possible after a spouse's death. This influenced inheritance, family structure, and social stability. Marriage wasn't just a personal choice, it was a permanent social and spiritual contract between two people, their families, and God, which leads naturally to remarriage, a common, even expected part of medieval life, especially after widowhood. For men, remarriage was often swift and practical. A widower with land, children, or a household needed a wife to manage it. Society saw an unmarried man, even a grieving one, as incomplete. You might see a lord in black robes already being courted by families offering eligible daughters, his mourning barely dry. For women, it was more complicated. A young widow, especially one with a dower, inherited land, or proven fertility, was a prized match. But she also became a pawn in property disputes. Her late husband's family might try to control her remarriage to keep assets within the lineage. In some regions, feudal lords held the right of wardship, allowing them to arrange or sell a widow's marriage for profit or alliance. Imagine grieving the loss of your husband, only to be treated as marital real estate. The church didn't forbid remarriage, but it viewed second unions, especially for women, as spiritually inferior. Some called them bigamy in a moral sense, though not legally, and widows who took vows of chastity or entered religious life were often held in higher esteem. This created tension, societal pressure to remarry for survival versus spiritual praise for remaining single. Children from a first marriage added another layer. Prenuptial agreements for second marriages were often, even more detailed, carefully protecting each child's inheritance. Family negotiations could be tense, even hostile, as new spouses entered households with existing heirs. Age mattered too. An older widow past childbearing years might be allowed to live independently, managing her dower lands in peace. But a young widow, remarriage was less a choice than a necessity for protection, status, and economic survival. So when you see a middle-aged nobleman courting a much younger woman shortly after his wife's death, don't assume callousness. In the medieval world, this was pragmatism, not passion. Grief had its place, but so did duty, lineage, and the relentless machinery of survival. But what of couples who are never married formally at all? In remote villages or among the poor, many unions began not with vows at the church door, but with a simple declaration: I take you as my husband-wife. If followed by cohabitation and public recognition, these common law marriages were often accepted by the community as valid, even if the church frowned upon them. Known as matrimonium per verba de presenti, marriage by words of the present, such unions required only mutual consent and the intent to be married now. If the couple said, I marry you, and then lived together as spouses, they were considered married in the eyes of neighbors, local courts, and often even canon law, especially before the 12th century, when the church tightened its control. Proof lay in behavior. Did they share a home, present themselves as husband and wife, pool their labor and resources? If so, the community treated them as married. This informal system caused endless headaches for the church, which pushed for public, priest-led ceremonies to prevent secret marriages, bigamy, and inheritance disputes. Yet it couldn't simply invalidate thousands of existing unions, so it compromised. Consent remained the core of marriage, but the church increasingly insisted it be expressed publicly, key with witnesses at the church door. So you might picture a weary priest sighing as yet another couple shows up years into their union, asking for a blessing, not because they doubt their marriage, but because the bishop demands it. The tension between lived reality and religious doctrine was constant. In the end, medieval marriage was never just one thing. It was a knot of contracts, customs, faith, and necessity, woven differently for a peasant in a thatched cottage and a queen in a stone keep, yet bound by the same unyielding truth. In a world of short lives and fragile fortunes, marriage was less about love and more about survival, legacy, and the quiet, collective hope for a better tomorrow. You might find yourself amidst a gathering in a humble village, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth far more prominent than any perfumed noble court. This is the world of the peasant wedding, modest, practical, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of agricultural life. Forget grand castles and dynastic schemes. For the vast majority of medieval people, marriage was not about politics, it was about survival, labor, and community. The historical truth is that peasant weddings, while lacking the pageantry of noble unions, were nonetheless significant communal events, celebrated with genuine joy and grounded pragmatism. For peasants, marriage wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the formation of a new economic unit. Two people merged their strength, skills, and resources to work the land, manage a household, and raise children who would one day help plow the fields or tend the livestock. A young man might admire a woman not for her beauty, but for her steady hands at the loom, her skill in preserving food, or her ability to calm a skittish goat. Likewise, a family might favor a suitor for his strong back, his knowledge of crop rotation, or his reputation for honesty. These were the real currencies of rural life. Betrothals among peasants were rarely sealed with parchment and wax. Instead, they were verbal agreements, spoken before a few trusted neighbors, the village elder, or the local priest. There might be a handshake, a shared cup of ale, or a small token exchanged, but the emphasis was on mutual understanding, not legal fine print. Dowries and dowers existed, but in humble form. A bride's dowry might include a milking cow, a flock of chickens, a sturdy cooking pot, a bolt of homespun wool, or a sack of grain from the last harvest. The groom's dower, his promise of support should he die, might be a verbal assurance that his widow could stay on a portion of his family's land or receive a share of the harvest. These weren't abstract assets, they were tranatals of survival. Directly tied to the couple's ability to eat, work, and thrive. You might see a young bride walking proudly beside her new husband, leading a single cow, the entirety of her dowry, toward their shared cottage. That cow isn't just livestock, it's milk for their children, cheese for winter, and perhaps a calf to sell at market. Every gift carries weight. Here's a charming detail. Peasant weddings were often timed to the agricultural calendar. Couples rarely married during planting or harvest season, times of backbreaking labor. Instead, weddings clustered in the late autumn, after the harvest was safely stored, or in the depths of winter, when fieldwork paused and communities had time to gather. A good harvest meant more food for the feast, fresh bread, preserved meats, apples, and plenty of ale brewed from surplus grain. In this world, your wedding date wasn't chosen for its astrological alignment, but for whether the barn was full and the frost had set in. The ceremony itself was simple. Often held at the church door, it might last only minutes. Vows spoken, a ring, if they had one, exchanged, perhaps a blessing from the priest. But the feast that followed was the heart of the celebration. Neighbors brought what they could, a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, a jar of honey, or a basket of turnips. The village might pool resources for a roasted pig or a communal stew. Music came from a fiddle or a pipe, dancing from bare feet on packed earth. Laughter echoed through the thatched roofs, and for one night, the burdens of daily toil lifted. Even the bedding ritual took a quieter form, perhaps just the bride's mother and a few female friends helping her into her best shift, tucking her and her groom into their shared bed with a few whispered blessings and a sprig of rosemary for luck. There were no crowds, no bawdy songs, just the quiet acknowledgement that two lives had joined and the community stood witness. For peasants, marriage was never just about two people. It was about weaving a new thread into the fabric of the village, a thread that would help mend nets, plant seeds, care for the sick, and carry the community forward through famine, frost, and feast alike. And in that simplicity, amidst the smell of bread and the sound of fiddles, you find something profound, a union not of crowns and contracts, but of shared labor, mutual care, and quiet hope. No grand declarations, no Latin vows, just two people saying, in their own way, I'll work beside you. I'll share your burden. We'll face this life together. It wasn't the stuff of troubadour songs, but for most of medieval Europe, it was the very bedrock of life itself. Historians still debate whether the timing of peasant weddings was driven purely by agricultural convenience, or whether these seasonal celebrations also carried echoes of older, pre-Christian rituals. Did late autumn unions honor harvest deities? Did winter weddings align with solstice traditions of renewal? The truth may lie somewhere in between, practical needs layered over ancient rhythms, reshaped by Christian doctrine, but never fully erased. Regardless, the ceremony itself remained strikingly simple. Held at the local parish church, often right at the church door, as canon law required, it was brief and direct. The village priest, perhaps juggling a dozen duties, would ask the couple their vows. A plain ring might be exchanged, if one could be spared. There were no choirs, no processions of attendants, no Latin chants beyond the bare essentials. The real heart of the wedding wasn't in the ritual, but in what came after, the feast. This was a communal triumph. Neighbors arrived with loaves of bread, wheels of cheese, jars of honey, and jugs of ale. Someone might contribute a hen, another a sack of apples. Together, they created a meal richer than any single household could afford alone. There would be rough-hewn tables under open skies or in a barn cleared for the occasion, music from a fiddler or a pipe, and dancing that lasted until the moon rose high. For many, this was the most abundant meal of the year, a rare pause in a life of relentless labor. And in that shared joy, you see the essence of peasant marriage. Not a contract between families, but a covenant of community. The village wasn't just attending a wedding, they were investing in it. Every gift, every song, every dance affirmed that this new household belonged to them, and they to it. Their survival was intertwined. You might find yourself swept into a circle dance, boots thudding on packed earth, laughter ringing through the cold air. In that moment, there's no king, no lord, no distant church, just people bound by soil, sweat, and the quiet promise of tomorrow. These were unions forged not by maps or dowry chests, but by the fundamental human need for companionship, resilience, and continuity in a world where both life and love were hard-won. But now let's ascend from the thatched roofs and muddy lanes to the stone towers and echoing halls of nobility, where marriage was less a celebration and more a strategic maneuver. In the world of lords and ladies, a wedding was never just about two people. It was a diplomatic instrument, a military alliance, a financial merger on a grand scale. You might feel the draft whistle through high-arched windows, carrying with it the weight of generations. Here, every gesture had consequence, every guest a hidden agenda. Noble weddings were meticulously orchestrated spectacles designed to project power, secure territory, and neutralize rivals. A single marriage could end a century of blood feuds or ignite a new era of prosperity. The selection of a spouse was rarely personal, it was geopolitical. A young lord might be betrothed at 5 to a girl he'd never met, their union sealing peace between warring baronies. A daughter's dowry might include not just gold, but castles, forests, and the loyalty of vassals. Negotiations unfolded over months, even years. Emissaries pored over genealogies to avoid forbidden degrees of kinship, because a marriage declared invalid by the church could unravel an entire inheritance. Maps were studied more closely than love letters. The goal? Legitimate heirs. Without them, a dynasty collapsed, lands reverted to the crown, and all that careful planning turned to dust. Here's a sobering detail. Because so much rested on a bride's ability to bear children, her fertility was a matter of state concern. While formal tests were rare, historical accounts and folklore hint at unsettling customs, older women discreetly assessing a young bride's health or readiness before the bedding. Whether these were widespread or merely whispered anxieties of a patriarchal system, they reveal the immense pressure placed on noble women, not as individuals, but as vessels of lineage. The wedding day itself was theater. The procession alone could stretch for miles. Knights in livery, ladies in silk, minstrels playing fanfares, wagons laden with gifts. The ceremony, held in a castle chapel or cathedral, featured incense, gilded vestments, and vows spoken before bishops and barons. The feast that followed was legendary. Peacocks served in their feathers, sugar sculptures of mythical beasts, wine flowing like rivers. Every detail screamed wealth, control, and permanence. Yet beneath the splendor lay tension. The bride might be trembling, not from joy but from fear of a stranger twice her age. The groom might be thinking of his lost freedom, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the bloodline, the lands, the legacy. In this world, marriage wasn't a beginning of love. It was the continuation of power. And at the very summit of this hierarchy stood royal weddings, where the fate of nations hung in the balance. Here, a princess wasn't a person, she was a living treaty. A prince wasn't a groom, he was a claimant to thrones. Royal marriages were the ultimate tools of statecraft, capable of uniting kingdoms or averting war without a single sword being drawn. Imagine a teenage princess, fluent in 3 languages, but never allowed to choose her own dress, being told she must sail across stormy seas to marry a king she's only seen in portraits. Her dowry, half a kingdom. Her purpose? To produce an heir who would merge 2 royal lines and prevent civil war. These unions were negotiated in candlelit chambers by kings, cardinals, and ambassadors. The couple's feelings were irrelevant. What mattered was stability, territory, and succession. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry II of England, she brought with her the richest duchy in France, reshaping the map of Europe. When Ferdinand of Aragon wed Isabella of Castile, they didn't just join hands, they united Spain. Even the ceremony became a global event. Ambassadors from distant courts attended. Chroniclers recorded every detail. Gifts poured in from empires. And the bedding ritual? Not just witnessed by family, but by envoys who would report back to their sovereigns whether the marriage had been consummated, because that act alone could mean peace or war. In royal hands, marriage was diplomacy made flesh. A wedding wasn't a day, it was a century in the making, and its echoes would shape history long after the last guest departed. So as you stand in that grand hall, watching a young queen-to-be walk down the aisle, remember, she isn't just marrying a man, she's marrying a destiny, one written not in stars but in treaties, bloodlines, and the unyielding logic of power. Of course, here is a continuation of your medieval wedding journey, now transformed into a living story. It remains open-ended, rich with sensory detail and historical texture, and runs just over 3,000 words. The last echoes of the charivari, the clanging pots, the drunken laughter, the off-key ballad about a knight in his very fertile sow, had finally faded into the damp night. Inside the stone-walled manor house, silence settled like dust on old parchment, but it was a silence heavy with expectation. Eleanor of Graymore sat rigidly on the edge of the great bed, her fingers knotted in the folds of her blue surcoat. The fabric embroidered with silver thread in the pattern of her family's crest, a stooping hawk over wheat, felt stiff and foreign against her skin. She'd worn it with pride during the procession, when the villagers had cheered and the minstrels had played so loudly her ears still rang. Now it felt like armor she couldn't remove. Across the chamber, Sir Reginald stood by the hearth, his back to her, staring into the dying embers. He hadn't spoken since the last guest had stumbled out, clutching a half-empty wineskin and slurring blessings. He was taller than she'd remembered from the formal viewing 3 days prior, broader in the shoulders, his dark hair cropped close in the military fashion. He looked less like a husband and more like a sentinel. Eleanor swallowed. She was 12 years and 8 months old. She knew her duty. She knew the terms of the contract, Greymoor's fertile riverlands for House Darcy's 20 loyal knights, and their fealty in the coming border skirmishes. She knew that her mother had wept silently while braiding her hair that morning, not from sorrow, but from relief. Relief that the alliance was secured, that Eleanor's older sister's failed betrothal would not doom them all. What she didn't know was what came next. A log shifted in the hearth, sending a shower of sparks upward. Reginald turned, his face half in shadow. His eyes, she noticed, were not the cold gray she'd expected, but a deep, troubled brown. "You may keep your shift on," he said, his voice low and rough, as if unused to speaking softly. "I've no wish to make this harder than it must be." Eleanor blinked. She'd been prepared for commands, for the awkward fumblings she'd heard whispered about in the solar by the older maids. She hadn't been prepared for consideration. "I thank you, my lord," she managed. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Reginald. My name is Reginald." At least in here, he moved away from the fire and toward a small table where a pitcher of water and 2 cups sat. "And you may call me that without the my lord. For now." He poured water into both cups and handed one to her. Their fingers didn't touch, but the simple act of sharing a drink in this charged space felt more intimate than any of the day's grand rituals. "I was betrothed once before," he said, not looking at her. "To a girl from the coast. She died of the sweating sickness before the banns were even read." Eleanor didn't know what to say. She'd been taught to listen, not to offer comfort. "She was 15, he continued, his gaze fixed on the wall where a tapestry depicted a boar hunt. "Old enough to have a mind of her own. Old enough to have told me she hated the sea. I never knew that until her maid told me at the funeral." He finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You are very young, Eleanor." "I am of canonical age," she replied quickly, parroting the words her father had drilled into her. The church is not in this room," he interrupted gently. "Only we are." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. Eleanor took a sip of water, her throat dry. "Will you annul it?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It was a desperate, foolish hope, but it was there. Reginald studied her for a long moment. "An annulment would mean war," he said at last. "Your father would see it as a betrayal. My father would see it as weakness. Our lands would burn, and our people would starve. Is that what you want?" "No," she whispered. "Nor do I." He set his cup down and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to peer out. "But a marriage is more than a contract on parchment. It is a life lived, and I will not force a life upon you that you cannot bear." He turned back to her, his face resolute. "Here is what I propose. We will live as husband and wife in the eyes of the world. We will share this hall, this table, this name, but in this chamber we will be companions. For now. You will have your own rooms adjoining this one. You will be treated with all the respect due to a lady of your station. And when you are older, truly older, not just of canonical age, you may decide for yourself what this marriage will be." Eleanor stared at him, stunned. It was a compromise she hadn't known was possible. A reprieve. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do this?" Reginald's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because I was once a boy who had no choice in his future. And because I would rather have a willing partner than a frightened child in my bed." He walked to the door and opened it, revealing a small antechamber where a pallet had been laid out with a fur blanket and a pillow. "I will sleep there tonight. The servants will see it and assume what they will. The important thing is that the household believes the marriage is proceeding as expected." He paused in the doorway. "Get some rest, Eleanor. Tomorrow we begin the real work of being lord and lady of this keep. There are stores to inspect, tenants to meet, and a harvest to bring in. The wedding is over. The marriage has just begun." He closed the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the fire and her whirling thoughts. For the first time that day, Eleanor felt a flicker of something other than dread. It wasn't love, not yet, perhaps not ever, but it was the first fragile thread of trust. The days that followed were a blur of new routines and quiet observation. Reginald was as good as his word. He treated her with a formal kindness that slowly, almost imperceptibly, warmed into something more genuine. He included her in his morning councils with the steward, not as a silent ornament, but by asking her opinion on matters concerning the household, where the new linen should be stored, how many chickens the kitchen needed for the winter. He remembered that she preferred her bread toasted and her wine watered. Eleanor, in turn, began to watch him, not as the faceless lord from the contract, but as a man. She saw how he knelt in the mud to help a tenant repair a broken cartwheel. She saw the way his eyes softened when he spoke to the old hound that followed him everywhere. She saw the exhaustion in his shoulders after a long day of settling disputes between villagers. One afternoon, while walking the perimeter of the outer bailey, they came upon a group of Tisharwi, children playing a game with sticks and a leather ball. One of the boys, no older than 6, tripped and fell, scraping his knee. Before Eleanor could react, Reginald was there, lifting the boy to his feet, brushing the dirt from his tunic, and producing a small honey cake from his pocket to soothe his tears. "He reminds me of my younger brother," Reginald said quietly as they walked on. "He died of a fever when he was 5. I was away at my knight's training. I never got to say goodbye." Eleanor didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she simply said, "You have a kind heart, my Reginald." He looked at her, surprised, then nodded. "And you, my lady, have a keen eye." Their evenings were spent in the solar, sometimes in silence as they read or mended clothing, sometimes in quiet conversation. He told her stories of his travels, of the strange customs he'd seen in distant lands. She, in turn, shyly shared her own dreams, not of grand balls or fine jewels, but of a herb garden she wanted to plant, of learning to read Latin so she could understand the books in the chapel. It was during one of these evenings that the first real threat to their fragile peace arrived. A messenger came at dusk, his horse lathered and trembling. He bore a sealed letter from Reginald's father, the Earl of Blackwood. Reginald broke the seal with a frown, his eyes scanning the page. His face grew grim. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. "My father has heard rumors," he said, his voice tight. "Rumors that our marriage has not been consummated. He says it is a matter of honor. He demands proof." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Proof? A stained sheet. A witness." Something. Reginald crumpled the letter in his fist. "He's sending his own steward to inspect the household in a fortnight. If he finds no evidence, he will declare the marriage a farce and petition the bishop for an annulment on grounds of non-consummation." "But that would mean—" "It would mean war," Reginald finished. "My father would use it as an excuse to break the alliance and seize Greymoor's lands, claiming your father tricked him into a false contract." Panic clawed at Eleanor's throat. Their careful arrangement, their quiet understanding, it was all about to be shattered by the cold logic of politics. "What do we do?" she whispered. Reginald was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the fire. Then he turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "There is only one way to satisfy my father and protect your home," he said slowly. "We must make the marriage real." Eleanor's breath caught. She'd known this moment would come, but she'd hoped for more time. She was still so young, her body not fully grown, her mind still a tangle of fear and curiosity. I am not ready," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I know," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But the world does not care for our readiness, Eleanor. It only cares for the appearance of order. We have 2 choices. We can let our families destroy each other over a technicality, or we can take control of our own story." He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I will not force you, not ever, but I am asking you. Will you trust me? Will you let me be your husband in truth, not just in name?" Eleanor looked into his eyes, those deep, troubled brown eyes, and saw not a predator, but a man as trapped by duty as she was. She saw the kindness he'd shown the boy, the grief he carried for his brother, the honor he'd shown her from the very beginning. She thought of her father's lands, of the villagers who depended on the harvest, of her mother's quiet strength. She thought of the herb garden she wanted to plant, of the life she was just beginning to imagine for herself. She took a deep breath. "Yes," she said. The night of the steward's arrival was cold and clear. Eleanor stood at the window of the bridal chamber, watching the torches of the approaching party wind their way up the hill. Her stomach was a knot of nerves, but her hands were steady. Behind her, Reginald fastened the clasp of her new gown, a deep red velvet, a gift from his mother, sent with a note that read, "Welcome to our family." "You look like a queen," he murmured. "I feel like a fraud," she admitted. "You are the Lady of Greymoor Darcy," he said, turning her to face him, "and you have faced this with more courage than most knights I know." He took her hand and led her to the door. "Remember the plan." They descended to the great hall together, where the steward, A thin, sharp-eyed man named Master Croft was already waiting, flanked by two of the Earl's guards. "Lady Eleanor," Croft said with a bow that was just short of respectful. "Lord Reginald, my lord sends his warmest regards and his keen interest in the success of your union." "Lady Eleanor," Croft said with a bow that was just short of respectful. "Lord Reginald, my lord sends his warmest regards and his keen interest in the success of your union." "We are honored by his concern," Reginald replied smoothly. "Please join us for supper. We have much to discuss." The meal was a tense affair. Croft asked pointed questions about the household, the harvest, the state of the armory. He watched Eleanor like a hawk, noting every interaction between her and Reginald. After the meal, as was custom, the bedding ceremony began. The women of the household, Eleanor's maids and Reginald's female servants, escorted her to the chamber, singing a traditional, if slightly off-key, song about hawks and doves. The men followed Reginald, their laughter a little too loud, their jokes a little too crude. But when the chamber door closed, the atmosphere shifted. The servants helped them into their nightclothes with efficient silence. A sprig of rosemary was tucked under the pillow for fertility. A cup of spiced wine was offered. Then, as tradition demanded, the guests began to leave. But as the last of them filed out, Reginald called out, "Wait!" Everyone froze. He walked to the bed and pulled back the top coverlet, revealing the sheet beneath. It was pristine white. Then, with a calmness that belied the tension in the room, he took a small vial from his bedside table and poured its contents onto the sheet near Eleanor's side. A dark red stain bloomed across the fabric. Wine thickened with a bit of pomegranate syrup to mimic the consistency of blood. A collective intake of breath came from the onlookers. Master Croft's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "Is that sufficient, Master Croft?" Reginald asked, his voice level. Croft stepped forward, examined the sheet with a critical eye, then gave a slow, satisfied nod. "It appears the marriage has been properly consummated, my lord. My lord the Earl will be pleased." He bowed deeply to them both. "I wish you many years of happiness and many healthy heirs." As the door closed behind him, the room exhaled. Eleanor sagged against the bedpost, her legs weak with relief. Reginald turned to her, his face pale but resolute. "It's done." She looked at the stained sheet, then at him. "Was that necessary?" "It was the only way," he said. "My father would not have accepted anything less." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. Then she walked to the hearth and took the poker, stirring the embers until they glowed bright red. "Then let us make sure there is no doubt," she said. She took the poker and pressed its hot tip to the edge of the stained sheet. The fabric blackened and curled, the smell of burning linen filling the air. Reginald stared at her, stunned. "Eleanor, what?" "If they want proof," she said, her voice steady, "let it be proof that cannot be undone or questioned. A burned sheet cannot be washed clean. A burned sheet is final." She met his gaze, her eyes blazing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "Let them see that our union is not a contract to be broken, but a bond that has been sealed, in fire if necessary." Reginald looked from the smoldering sheet to the fierce young woman before him, and for the first time he saw not a child, but a partner, a lady, a wife. He took her hand, the one that still held the poker, and gently pried it from her grip. "Then let it be so," he said. Outside, the wind howled around the towers of the keep, carrying with it the last whispers of doubt. Inside, a new chapter had begun, not with a grand declaration, but with a quiet act of defiance, a shared secret, and the first true spark of a marriage forged not by duty alone, but by choice. And in the days that followed, as the rumors of the burned sheet spread through the countryside, a new story began to take root, one not of political alliance, but of a lord and lady who had faced the fire together and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. But their story was far from over. For on the horizon, beyond the borders of their newly united lands, a different kind of storm was gathering. Whispers of rebellion in the north, a rival earl amassing troops, and a letter sealed with a wax sigil Eleanor didn't recognize, making its way toward Greymore on the back of a swift black horse. The Game of Thrones had not ended with their wedding. It had only just begun. Of course, here is the next chapter of Eleanor and Reginald's story, deepening their bond, raising the stakes, and weaving in new threats from beyond their walls. The narrative remains open-ended, rich with historical texture and emotional complexity. The burned sheet became legend before the week was out. It started with the laundress, who found the charred remnant in the hearth and told her sister, the miller's wife. By market day, the tale had grown wings. The Lady of Greymore had seared their marital bed with holy fire to seal their union against demons. By the time it reached the neighboring barony, she'd summoned a phoenix from the ashes to bless their lineage. Eleanor heard the rumors from her window, where she sat embroidering a new banner for the great hall. A hawk and a stag entwined beneath a single crown. She smiled faintly. Let them whisper. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. In the fortnight since Master Croft's departure, something had shifted between her and Reginald. It wasn't just the shared secret of the sheet, nor the quiet intimacy of their evenings in the solar. It was the way he now looked at her, not as a child to be protected, but as a mind to be consulted. He'd begun taking her with him on his rounds of the estate, not as a decorative consort, but as a partner. She learned to read the health of the fields by the color of the wheat, to judge a tenant's honesty by the set of his shoulders, to spot a sick ewe before the shepherd did. And when they returned to the keep, they would sit over maps of their combined lands, tracing borders with ink-stained fingers, planning crop rotations, discussing where to build a new mill. You have a strategist's mind, he told her one evening, watching her sketch a proposal for diverting a stream to irrigate the lower fields. And you, she replied, have a farmer's patience. He laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded. And for the first time, Eleanor felt something bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with duty. But peace, even the fragile kind they'd built, was never meant to last. The letter arrived on a rain-lashed morning, delivered not by a royal courier with fanfare, but by a mud-spattered boy on a lathered horse. He collapsed in the courtyard, the wax seal on the parchment already smudged by rain. Reginald broke the seal in the great hall, his face unreadable as he read. Then he handed it to Eleanor without a word. To Lord Reginald Darcy and Lady Eleanor of Greymore, by order of His Grace, the Duke of Viridian, you are summoned to attend the High Court at Dunhaven on the Feast of St. Michael. A matter of grave import concerning the succession of the Marcherlands requires your presence and testimony. Failure to appear will be construed as treason. Sealed by the hand of the Chancellor. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The Marcherlands, the wild, contested borderlands between the kingdom and the northern clans, had been a powder keg for generations. Her father's holdings bordered them to the south, Reginald's to the east. Their marriage had been meant to stabilize that very frontier. What does this mean, she asked, her voice tight. Reginald ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched. It means someone has challenged the legitimacy of our union, or our claim to the border territories. And they've done it at the highest level. Who would dare? The Duke of Viridian wouldn't issue such a summons without provocation, Reginald said grimly. And there's only one man with both the motive and the reach to pull the Duke's strings. Lord Torvin, Eleanor breathed. Torvin of Blackfen, a ruthless baron whose lands lay just beyond the northern marches. He'd coveted Greymoor's riverlands for years, and had been furious when her father chose Reginald over his own son as her betrothed. He'd sent threats, then raiding parties disguised as bandits. Now it seemed he was moving to the political battlefield. We have 3 weeks to prepare, Reginald said, and we must go. If we refuse, Torvin will claim we're hiding something, perhaps that our marriage is invalid after all. Eleanor nodded, her mind already racing. Then we go. But we don't go as supplicants. We go as equals. As a united house, Reginald looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. And how do you propose we do that? We take our proof with us, she said, not just the burned sheet, though I'll have the laundress swear to it, but our people. We bring the miller, the blacksmith, the head tenant from Greymore and from your lands. We bring witnesses who can testify that we rule together, that our union is real in every way that matters. Reginald was silent for a long moment. Then he smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. You, he said, are going to be a formidable lady. The journey to Dunhaven was a trial in itself. They traveled with a modest retinue, 20 men at arms, their household servants, and the 6 witnesses Eleanor had chosen. The roads were muddy from autumn rains, and the nights were cold enough to see their breath in the firelight. But it was in those quiet campfires that Eleanor saw a new side of Reginald. He didn't just command his men, he knew them. He shared his rations with the youngest squire, mended a broken wheel himself when their cart broke down, and sat with the old blacksmith, listening to tales of the old king's wars. One night as they sat by the fire, Eleanor asked him the question that had been haunting her. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Marrying me, I mean. You could have had a woman of your own choosing, a woman of age, of experience." Reginald poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the dark. "I used to think marriage was a cage," he said after a long pause, "a duty to be endured. But you've shown me it can be a partnership, a shared purpose." He turned to her, his face half lit by the flames. "I don't regret it, Eleanor." Not for a single moment her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. Just for a moment. Just long enough to let him know she felt the same. He didn't pull away. Dunhaven was a city of stone and shadow. Perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, its great keep loomed over the harbor like a sentinel. Banners of every noble house in the realm snapped in the salt-laced wind, and the streets teemed with petitioners, merchants, and spies. They were given quarters in the guest wing of the keep, a small but well-appointed chamber with a view of the inner courtyard. That night, as they prepared for bed, a soft knock came at the door. It was a servant bearing a sealed note. "Meet me in the chapel at midnight. Come alone. Your future depends on it. A friend." Eleanor showed it to Reginald, her hands trembling. "It's a trap," he said immediately. "Or an opportunity," she countered. "If someone inside the Duke's court is willing to help us, we can't ignore it." "I won't let you go alone." "You must," she insisted. "If they see you with me, they'll never speak." "But I'm just a girl, a harmless bride." "They'll underestimate me," Reginald argued. But in the end, he relented. "Take this," he said, pressing a small dagger into her hand. "And if you're not back by the first bell, I'm coming for you." The chapel was cold and empty, lit only by a single candle on the altar. Eleanor waited, her heart pounding, the dagger hidden in her sleeve. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, an older woman in the plain gray robes of a lady-in-waiting. "You came," the woman said, her voice low and urgent. "Who are you?" Eleanor asked. "Lady Isolde," the woman replied. "I served your mother-in-law, the Countess of Blackwood, before she died, and I know why Lord Torvin is so desperate to break your marriage." She stepped closer. "He's not just after your lands. He's after the Greymore Vault." Eleanor frowned. "The vault?" "It's just a storeroom for old deeds and harvest records." "Is it?" Lady Isolde's eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "Your grandfather didn't just store grain, child. He stored something far more valuable, something the old king entrusted to him before the rebellion. A charter, a royal decree that names the true heir to the Marcher lands." Eleanor's breath caught. The Marcher lands had been ruled by a council of barons for a century, their loyalty bought and sold with golden blood. "If such a charter existed, Torvin believes it's hidden in the vault," Lady Isolde continued, "and he thinks your marriage is the key to getting to it. If he can prove your union is invalid, the vault reverts to your father's line, and he can pressure your father into opening it." "But my father doesn't even know it exists," Eleanor whispered. "Exactly," Lady Isolde said, "which is why you must protect it, and why you must win at court." She pressed a small key into Eleanor's hand. "This opens a hidden compartment beneath the altar in your family chapel. The charter is there. Take it to Dunhaven. Present it to the Duke yourself. It's your only chance." Before Eleanor could respond, the woman melted back into the shadows, leaving her alone with the candle and the weight of a secret that could change the fate of the realm. The High Court convened in the Great Hall of Dunhaven Keep. The Duke of Viridian sat on a raised dais, flanked by his advisors and the royal chancellor. Below him, the petitioners stood in rows, barons, bishops, and bailiffs, all watching with hungry eyes. Lord Torvin stood at the center of it all, resplendent in black velvet trimmed with silver. He looked every inch the wrong nobleman. "Your Grace," and he began, his voice smooth as poisoned honey, "I come before you not out of malice, but out of duty. The recent union between House Darcy and House Greymore is irregular. The bride was but a child, the marriage was rushed, and there are whispers, persistent whispers, that it has not been consummated." A murmur ran through the hall. Reginald stepped forward, his bearing calm. "The marriage was lawful in every respect, my lord. The banns were read. The vows were exchanged. The union was consummated, as any of our household can attest." "Convenient," Torvin sneered. "But where is your proof? A stained sheet can be faked. Witnesses can be bought." "Then let us settle it with truth," Eleanor said, stepping forward. All eyes turned to her. She was small beside the towering men of the court, but her voice rang clear. She walked to the center of the hall and knelt before the Duke. From the folds of her cloak she drew not a sheet, but a rolled parchment sealed with the royal crest. "This," she said, "is the Charter of Marcher Succession, granted by King Alastair III to my great-grandfather for his loyalty during the Border Rebellion. It names the rightful steward of the Marcher lands, and confirms that the lands of Greymore and Darcy are to be held in perpetuity by their united heirs." A gasp went up from the crowd. Even the Duke leaned forward, his eyes wide. Torvin's face went pale. "That's a forgery." "Is it?" Eleanor asked calmly. "Then let the royal archivist examine it. Let the ink be tested. Let the seal be broken." The Duke nodded to his chancellor, who took the charter with trembling hands. For a long, tense hour, the court waited in silence as the document was examined, cross-referenced, and verified. Finally, the chancellor returned to the dais. "It is genuine, Your Grace," he announced. "The charter is authentic." The Duke's eyes narrowed as he looked at Torvin. "It seems, my lord, that your concerns were misplaced." Torvin fell to his knees, his face ashen. "Your Grace, Enough," the Duke said coldly. "You have wasted the court's time with baseless accusations. For this, you are stripped of your claim to the northern marches. The lands are hereby granted to House Greymore Darcy, in recognition of their loyalty and their rightful inheritance." As the guards led a sputtering Torvin away, the Duke turned to Eleanor and Reginald. "You have done the realm a great service," he said, "but remember, power attracts enemies. Guard your charter well." "We will, Your Grace," Reginald said, bowing. As they left the hall, hand in hand, Eleanor felt a strange mix of triumph and dread. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. For as they passed through the courtyard, a hooded figure watched them from the shadows, a raven perched on his shoulder. In his hand, he held a letter sealed with a sigil Eleanor had never seen before. A serpent coiled around a sword, and far to the north, beyond the mountains, drums began to beat. The clans were stirring, and they did not recognize charters or kings. Of course, here is the next chapter of Eleanor and Reginald's saga, deepening their alliance, introducing new threats from the north, and weaving in ancient secrets that blur the line between history and myth. The story remains open-ended, immersive, and runs just over 3,000 words. The victory at Dunhaven tasted sweeter than honeyed wine, yet left a bitter aftertaste. On the journey home, Eleanor clutched the Charter of Marcher Succession inside a leather satchel lined with wool, its weight a constant reminder that power was never given, only taken, and fiercely defended. Reginald rode beside her, his gaze often drifting to the northern horizon, where storm clouds gathered even on clear days. "They'll come," he said one evening, as they camped near the River Vire. "Torvin may be disgraced, but he's not broken." "And the clans, they don't care about royal charters?" Eleanor nodded, stirring the stew in the iron pot over the fire. "Then we must be ready." But readiness, she was learning, wasn't just about swords and walls. It was about trust. And in the weeks since Dunhaven, something had shifted between them, not just in duty, but in desire. It began with glances held a moment too long, with hands brushing as they passed a map or a goblet of wine. One night, as they reviewed Border Patrol reports by candlelight, Reginald reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek, rough from wind and war, yet impossibly gentle. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low. She looked up, her breath catching. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but the space between them hummed with something new, something real. "I would have you choose me," he said, "not because the charter demands it, but because your heart does." She placed her hand over his. "It already has." They returned to Greymore Keep to find it transformed. Word of their triumph had spread like wildfire. Tenants lined the road, cheering as they passed. Banners bearing the hawk and stag flew from every tower. Even the old hound, Rufus, barked joyfully as they dismounted. But amid the celebration, a stranger waited in the courtyard. He was tall and lean, wrapped in a cloak of undyed wool, his face weathered by wind and sun. At his side hung a sword unlike any Eleanor had seen, its hilt carved from antler, its scabbard etched with spirals and runes. "Lord Reginald," the man said, bowing deeply. "Lady Eleanor, I am Cale of the Stone Hills. I come from the northern clans." Reginald's hand went to his own sword. "Clansmen do not cross the border unless blood is owed or war is declared." "No war," Kyle said, his voice calm. "Only warning." He reached into his cloak and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oiled leather. Inside lay a raven's feather, black as midnight, and a shard of obsidian etched with the same serpent and sword sigil Eleanor had seen in Dunhaven. "The drummers stir," Cale said. "They speak of a shadow rising in the high passes, a warlord who calls himself the Serpent King. He claims the old blood of the first kings, and he says the southern lords have forgotten the old pacts." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The first kings were legend, mythical rulers who'd united the clans in the lowlands before the realm fractured into feuding baronies. No one had claimed that bloodline in centuries. "What does he want?" Reginald asked. "The Marcher lands," Cale replied, "and the vault beneath Greymore Chapel." Eleanor stiffened. "How does he know about the vault?" Kyle's eyes met hers, sharp and knowing. "Because your grandfather did not hide the charter alone. He hid something else, something older. Something the Serpent King believes is his birthright." Before they could question him further, Kyle turned and walked away, vanishing into the mist like a ghost. That night, Eleanor dreamed of fire and feathers. She stood in the chapel, the charter in her hands, but the walls were melting into stone arches older than the kingdom itself. A voice whispered in a language she didn't know, yet understood. "The blood remembers what the mind forgets." She woke gasping, her nightgown soaked in sweat. Reginald was already awake, standing by the window, his silhouette tense. "You felt it too," she said. He turned, his face grim. "The drums. They've started." In the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the deep, rhythmic thud of war drums, echoing from the northern mountains. The next morning they rode to the chapel. It stood on a hill overlooking the river, its stone walls moss-covered and ancient. Inside, the air was cool and still, scented with beeswax and dried herbs. Eleanor knelt before the altar and pressed the hidden latch Lady Isolde had described. A stone panel slid open, revealing a small cavity. Inside lay not just the charter, but a second object, a bronze amulet shaped like a coiled serpent eating its own tail. "The Ouroboros," Reginald whispered, "the symbol of eternity, of cycles." As Eleanor lifted it, a hidden compartment beneath the amulet clicked open. Inside was a scroll, its parchment brittle with age. They unrolled it carefully. The script was archaic, but Reginald, who'd studied old tongues with his tutor, could read enough. "To the keeper of the threshold. When the serpent rises and the raven flies, the blood of the first kings shall awaken. The vault is not a tomb, but a key. Beneath the altar lies the gate. Guard it well, for what sleeps below must not wake." Alistair, last of the true kings. Eleanor's hands trembled. "What gate? What sleeps below?" Reginald's face was pale. "I don't know. But I think your grandfather didn't just store a charter. He sealed something." Over the next week, they prepared for war. Reginald sent riders to every loyal vassal, calling men to arms. He reinforced the walls, stockpiled grain, and drilled the garrison until they moved as one. Eleanor, meanwhile, turned the keep into a fortress of another kind. She organized the women to boil oil, sharpen arrows, and weave bandages. She sent word to the apothecaries for wolfsbane and nightshade, poisons for the wells if the keep fell. But she also did something else. She visited the oldest woman in the village, Mara the Weaver, who claimed her grandmother had served Eleanor's great-grandmother. "Tell me about the vault," Eleanor asked. Mara's eyes grew distant. "It's not just a cellar, child. It's a passage. They say the first kings built their thrones on sacred ground, places where the veil between worlds is thin. Greymore sits on one such place." "What's below?" Eleanor pressed. Mara leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "Not treasure, not gold, but a slumbering thing, a guardian bound by oath and blood, your family's blood." The charter wasn't just proof of lineage. It was a ward Eleanor returned to the keep shaken. That night she told Reginald everything. "So the Serpent King isn't just after land," he said slowly. "He wants to break the ward, to wake whatever's down there." "And if he succeeds?" Eleanor asked. Reginald looked out the window at the darkening sky. "Then we won't be fighting men. We'll be fighting something older than the kingdom itself." The first attack came at dawn, not with siege engines or battering rams, but with silence. The watchman on the west tower was found dead, his throat slit, his eyes wide with terror. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just a single raven feather pinned to his chest with a bone dagger. "They're inside the walls," Reginald said, his voice tight. Panic rippled through the keep, but Eleanor stood tall in the great hall, her voice ringing with authority. "Seal the inner gates, double the guards, and bring me every man who knows the old tunnels beneath the keep, for Greymore, like many ancient strongholds, had secret passages, built for escape, for smuggling, for things best left hidden." As the day wore on, more bodies were found. A stable boy, a cook, all killed with the same precision, the same feather left behind. Then at dusk, a horn sounded from the north, not a war horn, a hunting horn, and from the tree line they emerged, not an army, a procession. At its center rode a man on a black stallion, his armor forged from blackened steel, his cloak stitched with raven feathers. His face was hidden behind a mask of polished bone, but his eyes, pale and piercing, fixed on the keep. Behind him walked a dozen warriors, their skin marked with blue woad, their weapons glinting in the dying light. And among them, bound and gagged, was Cale. The Serpent King raised a hand. A scroll was unfurled by his squire. "Eleanor of Greymore," his voice boomed, smooth and cold as riverstone. "You hold what is mine by blood and right. Surrender the amulet and the charter, and your people will be spared. Resist, and I will peel the stones of your keep one by one until nothing remains but dust and bones." Eleanor stepped onto the battlement, Reginald at her side. "We do not bargain with thieves and murderers," she called back. The Serpent King laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "I am no thief, little hawk. I am the heir of Alistair, and you are the last of the keepers. You know what sleeps below. Do you truly wish to be the one who wakes it?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. He knew. Before she could respond, an arrow whistled past her ear, fired from the keep. The Serpent King didn't flinch. He simply turned and rode back into the trees, his warriors vanishing like smoke. But Cale remained, left tied to a post at the edge of the field. That night, under cover of darkness, Reginald led a small party to retrieve him. They found him half dead from thirst, his face bruised, but his spirit unbroken. "He knows about the gate," Kyle rasped as they carried him inside. "He believes the guardian below is not a protector, but a weapon, and he means to wield it." "Why help us?" Reginald asked. "Your clan." "Because the old pacts were not just about land," Kyle said, his eyes burning. "They were about balance. The Serpent King seeks to break that balance. If he wakes what sleeps below, it will not serve him. It will consume everything." In the days that followed, the keep became a crucible. Eleanor and Reginald pored over every map, every family record, every scrap of lore. They discovered that the vault beneath the chapel connected to a network of tunnels that ran deep into the hillside, tunnels that led to a chamber marked only as the threshold. "We have to seal it," Reginald said, "before he finds the entrance." But Eleanor hesitated. What if the Guardian is the only thing that can stop him? What if we're meant to wake it? Or what if waking it is exactly what he wants? Reginald countered. They were trapped between faith and fear, duty and destiny. Then on the eve of the autumn equinox, the night when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest, the drums stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. That night, Eleanor dreamed again. This time she stood in the threshold chamber. The walls were carved with stars and serpents, and in the center rose a stone dais. On it lay a figure wrapped in burial cloth, but its chest rose and fell with slow, steady breath. A voice echoed in her mind. "The keeper must choose. Seal the gate, and the land will fall to the serpent. Open it, and the Guardian will rise, but at a price." "What price?" she asked. "The blood of the first kings flows in you, Eleanor. To wake me, you must offer your own." She woke with a gasp, her hand pressed to her chest, as if something ancient had stirred within her. She found Reginald in the armory, sharpening his sword. "I know what we have to do," she said. He looked up, his eyes searching hers. "Tell me." "We don't seal the gate," she said. "We prepare to open it." Reginald went very still. "Eleanor, if the legends are true—" "Legends are all we have," she interrupted. "And if there's even a chance that the Guardian can stop him, we have to try." He set down his whetstone, and Reginald looked out the window at the darkening sky. "Then we won't be fighting men. We'll be fighting something older than the kingdom itself." The first attack came at dawn, not with siege engines or battering rams, but with silence. The watchman on the west tower was found dead, his throat slit, his eyes wide with terror. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just a single raven feather pinned to his chest with a bone dagger. "They're inside the walls," Reginald said, his voice tight. Panic rippled through the keep, but Eleanor stood tall in the great hall, her voice ringing with authority. "Seal the inner gates, double the guards, and bring me every man who knows the old tunnels beneath the keep, for Greymore, like many ancient strongholds, had secret passages, built for escape, for smuggling, for things best left hidden." As the day wore on, more bodies were found. A stable boy, a cook, all killed with the same precision, the same feather left behind. Then at dusk, a horn sounded from the north, not a war horn, a hunting horn, and from the tree line they emerged, not an army, a procession. At its center rode a man on a black stallion, his armor forged from blackened steel, his cloak stitched with raven feathers. His face was hidden behind a mask of polished bone, but his eyes, pale and piercing, fixed on the keep. Behind him walked a dozen warriors, their skin marked with blue woad, their weapons glinting in the dying light. And among them, bound and gagged, was Cale. The Serpent King raised a hand. A scroll was unfurled by his squire. "Eleanor of Greymore!" His voice boomed, smooth and cold as riverstone. "You hold what is mine by blood and right. Surrender the amulet and the charter, and your people will be spared. Resist, and I will peel the stones of your keep one by one until nothing remains but dust and bones." Eleanor stepped onto the battlement, Reginald at her side. "We do not bargain with thieves and murderers," she called back. The Serpent King laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "I am no thief, little hawk. I am the heir of Alistair, and you are the last of the keepers. You know what sleeps below. Do you truly wish to be the one who wakes it?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. He knew. Before she could respond, an arrow whistled past her ear, fired from the keep. The Serpent King didn't flinch. He simply turned and rode back into the trees, his warriors vanishing like smoke. But Cale remained, left tied to a post at the edge of the field. That night, under cover of darkness, Reginald led a small party to retrieve him. They found him half dead from thirst, his face bruised, but his spirit unbroken. "He knows about the gate," Cal rasped as they carried him inside. "He believes the Guardian below is not a protector, but a weapon, and he means to wield it." "Why help us?" Reginald asked. "Your clan." "Because the old pacts were not just about land," Kyle said, his eyes burning. "They were about balance. The Serpent King seeks to break that balance. If he wakes what sleeps below, it will not serve him. It will consume everything. In the days that followed, the keep became a crucible. Eleanor and Reginald pored over every map, every family record, every scrap of lore. They discovered that the vault beneath the chapel connected to a network of tunnels that ran deep into the hillside, tunnels that led to a chamber marked only as the threshold. "We have to seal it," Reginald said, "before he finds the entrance." But Eleanor hesitated. "What if the Guardian is the only thing that can stop him? What if we're meant to wake it? Or what if waking it is exactly what he wants?" Reginald countered. They were trapped between faith and fear, duty and destiny. Then on the eve of the autumn equinox, the night when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest, the drums stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. That night Eleanor dreamed again. This time she stood in the threshold chamber. The walls were carved with stars and serpents, and in the center rose a stone dais. On it lay a figure wrapped in burial cloth, but its chest rose and fell with slow, steady breath. A voice echoed in her mind. "The keeper must choose. Seal the gate, and the land will fall to the serpent. Open it, and the guardian will rise, but at a price." "What price?" she asked. "The blood of the first kings flows in you, Eleanor. To wake me, you must offer your own." She woke with a gasp, her hand pressed to her chest, as if something ancient had stirred within her. She found Reginald in the armory, sharpening his sword. "I know what we have to do," she said. He looked up, his eyes searching hers. "Tell me." "We don't seal the gate," she said. "We prepare to open it." Reginald went very still. "Eleanor, if the legends are true—" "Legends are all we have," she interrupted. "And if there's even a chance that the Guardian can stop him, we have to try." He set down his whetstone and, "No," she said gently. "You stay here. Hold the keep. If I fail, you must be ready to burn it all to the ground." He wanted to argue. She saw it in his eyes, but he nodded. "Then swear me one thing," he said. "Swear you'll come back." She kissed him then, fully, fiercely, as if to seal the promise in breath and blood. "I swear it," she whispered. At midnight, Eleanor descended into the vault alone. Kyle, weak but determined, guided her through the tunnels, his knowledge of the old ways proving invaluable. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the walls slick with moisture, the silence so profound it hummed. Finally, they reached the threshold. The chamber was exactly as in her dream. The dais, the wrapped figure, the carvings that seemed to shift in the torchlight. Kel placed a hand on her shoulder. "The ritual requires three things: the amulet, the charter, and a drop of royal blood." Eleanor drew the dagger Reginald had given her and pricked her finger. Blood welled, dark and bright. She placed the amulet on the dais. She unrolled the charter at its base. Then she let her blood fall onto the burial cloth. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the ground trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. The carvings on the walls began to glow with a soft, silver light, and the figure on the dais sat up. The cloth fell away, revealing not a monster, not a beast, but a woman. Tall and pale, with eyes like moonlight and hair like spun silver. She wore armor of a style no one had seen in centuries, and at her hip hung a sword that seemed to drink the light around it. She looked at Eleanor, and her voice was like wind through ancient trees. "You have awakened me, Keeper, but the price is not yet paid." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, a roar echoed from the tunnel behind them. The Serpent King stood at the entrance, his bone mask gone, his face revealed, sharp-featured, cruel, and undeniably familiar. "Hello, cousin," he said, his smile cold. "Did you really think you were the only one with royal blood?" Eleanor stared, stunned. He had her grandfather's eyes. The Guardian rose to her feet, her hand on her sword. "So," she said, "the betrayer returns." The Serpent King laughed. "I don't want to kill you, Guardian. I want to free you. Together, we can reclaim what was stolen." "You understand nothing," the Guardian said. "The pact was not about power. It was about protection." She turned to Eleanor. "The choice is yours, Keeper. Will you stand with the betrayer or with the oath?" Eleanor looked from the Serpent King, her own blood, to the Guardian. to Kyle, who stood ready to fight. And in that moment, she understood. This was never just about land or lineage. It was about what kind of world they would build from the ashes of the old. She stepped forward, placing herself between the Guardian and the Serpent King. "I stand with the oath," she said. The Guardian smiled, and the chamber filled with light. Outside, the drums began to beat again. But this time, they were answered, from within the hill itself.